could it be? It's me, Austin! Oh, son of a bitch!
Ah, My Hero Academia. How the tables have turned. If you have been paying any attention to the manga sphere at all, you might have noticed one thing about Koi Horikoshi's hit shonen manga. Namely, that a lot of these recent chapters have been getting mixed reception. How did a popular darling like My Hero get to a point where each and every one of its plot points gets hyper-scrutinized and broken down? Where any enthusiasm regarding the series is being overshadowed by a general air of either cynicism or aggressive defensiveness?
That is an excellent question. I, for one, cannot wait to explore it in a calm, uncontroversial way. Hello everyone, I'm Raymond McNeil, the Celtic Phoenix. I've been a fan of My Hero Academia for quite some time now, primarily through the anime. After falling off partway through Season 4, I recently got back on the wagon and finished up the anime through Season 6, and am currently keeping up with Season 7's run through the dub. But if it had stopped there, we wouldn't have this video. No, after finishing Season 6, I heard about some of the most common critical complaints against the series, both reasonable and unreasonable, and was struck by a bout of madness. I was going to sit down with the manga, read it start to finish, and take detailed notes along the way, so I could see what criticisms definitively stick, which ones are only hanging by a couple of threads, and which ones hold no water whatsoever. At time of writing, I have read up to current with chapter 425, and I fully expect 426 or even 427 to be out and in my notes by the time I have this video recorded and in the editing bay. Update? Yeah, so those chapters definitely came in past. And so did the rest of the series. My Hero Academia finished its run with chapter 430 while I was making this video. Over the course of its run, I filled a notebook with 139 pages of detailed notes, and they've been categorized by the 20 plus most common complaints leveraged against the series. If things ever feel disjointed in this video, it's probably because I made edits to account for this and I might have missed something. So, apologies in advance for that. I fully intended to make my own standalone video going through those notes and discussing the commonly perceived flaws, and I may still in the future. However, one of the sources for those commonly perceived flaws caught my eye, a video essay by YouTuber Ocean Is, the intro of which I just showed you. It is titled The Arc That Broke MHA, and I hope you'll see as we go through it why I decided to do a response video format instead. Now, I want to qualify here, this video is in no way made with any ill intent. There are certainly points where I'll be, let's say, emphatic, and may even use some strong language. But at the end of the day, this is just a video on the internet, and what I'm covering are opinions I disagree with. So Ocean Is, if you or any of your fans are watching, please try not to take any of this personally. This is a critique, not a hit piece. Now, no more dawdling. Let's get right to it.
I cannot and will not speak for anyone else, but in my case, MHA has lost a lot of what made it special, and the more mixed reactions to its final arc give me some degree of confidence that I am not just entirely insane.
Well, so far you seem pretty reasonable. Hopefully there isn't anything later that might change that.
Thus, I want to indulge in this general negative vibe a bit in order to figure out and elaborate on why, how, and when MHA lost the plot, figuratively and literally.
That last one's going to be interesting to explain. Kinda hard to literally lose a plot, but you know what? What's a red flag between friends, am I right? Keep going.
One arc in particular stands out as the moment MHA broke, in my opinion.
Ooh, that's a bad sign. I'll explain later, like much later, like end of this entire video on MHA later, but just bookmark this use of "in my opinion" in your brain. It'll be important.
Spoilers for the manga, obviously.
Alright, bold title, buddy. Let's see what you got. Also, gotta thank you for using so much insert music for these slides and keeping them on screen for like 30 seconds at a time. Really eats up the runtime of your video I don't have to actively analyze. Makes my life a whole lot easier. Also, should probably be self-evident, but manga spoilers are going to be laid across not just his video, but this entire video that you're currently watching. His only goes up through chapter 357 as far as I can tell, but I'll be referencing the full completed story as we go through this video, so keep that in mind while watching. This is your official spoiler warning.
I guess we should first define what broke and broken even means in this context. Has the story turned into an unintelligible mess? No, not really. Value judgments aside, the narrative is still functional and fulfills the criteria of being, well, a story.
That's an interesting way to start. If I didn't know it, it kind of feels like you just undermined the whole purpose of your video right there. It's kind of strange, especially since you mentioned that whole literally lost the plot thing like 30 seconds back. But you know what? Benefit of the doubt, you're clearly going somewhere with this. Keep on keeping on.
Has the financial revenue of the series crashed then? Also no. In fact, the volumes are selling way higher than they ever did.
Not that you'd ever use the phrase broken to describe a financial struggle in this context. Typically the word people would use for that is failing. Also, this video is focused on the writing quality, so I don't even know why revenue would be brought up in the first place. But I'm getting persnickety with it, you're making a point.
So how can a story that still functions and still sells hundreds of thousands of books be broken? Maybe to you, it cannot. But to me, a story simply being functional isn't enough. And money doesn't really matter to me when I try to assess how I perceive quality, it's just kind of not important to me.
I suppose that's good to hear. Some people assert those kinds of metrics to demonstrate quality when all they're indicative of is popularity, and even then, they're not perfect. Also, you're going to have to define what it means for a story to be functional at some point, just for clarity's sake, and to make sure we're all on the same criteria.
What I mean when I say MHA is broken is that it has lost something crucial. A codifying style of pacing, structure, and payoff that up until a certain point was the core of its identity, at least to me.
I think there's something agreeable there, but you couched it in this kind of slippery phrase, at least to me. It doesn't strike me like you have a very confident argument if you have to slap that on there.
MHA is broken because it lost that something that made it special, that made it My Hero Academia. So, I guess we better get around to describing what that something actually is. This is obviously going to be very subjective, but to me, what made MHA special was a specific intersection of three elements: preparation, deliberation, and consequence, as well as the intense, singular focus each of them received. Now, all three of these are present in any good story, but their specific mix was what made MHA special to me.
What? Preparation, deliberation, consequence? One moment. Deliberation. The act of thinking about or discussing something and deciding carefully. Careful consideration before decision. I think I know what you're getting at, but I'm going to need you to elaborate because I don't think you're using the correct words, and it might actually be worse than that. Also, can you please stop saying, to me? We know this is your opinion. Not only is it your video, which should make that implicit, but you've also said it like 3 or 4 times, especially if you count subjectively.
The majority of the series was structured in a way where current events were always preparing future events in a clear and deliberate manner, to then follow up on them with believable and interesting consequences. The second element, deliberation, is especially crucial here. There was always a point, a purpose to the various narrative beats, purpose which was founded on solid planning and the willingness to make those beats have lasting impacts. And most importantly, that deliberation was not just for the sake of progressing the story, not just to move forward, but because there was something interesting to be said here.
Okay, yeah, it's as I feared. I highly recommend looking into storytelling basics because you aren't using the correct words at all. Instead of preparation, you want to use the word establishment. Instead of deliberation, you want to use the word development. And instead of consequences, well, that one's kind of right, but you're missing an important step before it: resolution. Often those two come hand in hand. As to the part where you describe there was something interesting to be said there, that would be themes. This is all basic storytelling 101 terminology, and it bothers me greatly that you're doing a storytelling dissection without knowing them. And I need to point out that, yes, you're right, these are present in any good story, but that's because they're the fundamental building blocks of the Aristotelian narrative structure, something I learned about in 7th grade English. What you're describing, at least with preparation and deliberation, are terms related to character actions within the narrative, not words describing the narrative itself, because the narrative has already been prepared and deliberated upon. The narrative does not prepare itself or deliberate upon itself as you are reading it. It's already done. It's been presented to you in a final state. Establishment is the setup. Information about the characters of the story, setting, plot, and stakes are exposited to us, the audience, by the story so that we understand the context of the events in front of us. Then there's the development, otherwise known as the rising action, where all of these components we've been told about play off each other towards some form of conclusion. This leads to a resolution where the stakes are either gained or lost. It's effectively a narrative game where there's a win, a loss, or some form of draw. And if the story continues, consequences can then flow out of the resolution, where a new set of challenges or rewards are presented to our heroes as a result of what happened previously, potentially even starting its own new arc in the process. This is why we call major sections of stories arcs, because they typically follow this pattern. MHA is in no way unique in having this, and I don't know where you're going with this, if I'm being completely honest. It worries me that I have to lay something this basic out not even 5 minutes into an hour and 20-minute long video.
Let's look at this structure through an actual example, or rather, a question. Why was it Ida and Todoroki who fought alongside Deku in the Stain arc? Dumb question, because those are the characters the author put there, duh. But why them, specifically? The Stain arc is so early on, it could have been anyone else's brother who got hurt. It didn't need to be Tensei. You could have literally just made a brother up. At this point, we hadn't really seen most of the families.
I mean, you're not wrong, but you're also not right. There's a lot of people that like to pretend that writing is this thing where you sit down and hash out 100% as you go, like meticulously building a blueprint to a skyscraper, when typically that's the furthest thing from the truth. Most writers are, in some way, flying by the seats of their pants, generating plot points out of thin air. It's possible Stain existed beforehand and Tensei was randomly generated by Horikoshi to be a foil, or perhaps it was the other way around, where Tenya and Tensei existed in Horikoshi's mind and he needed a way to challenge the entire Ida family. Point being, it could have actually been anyone. It's just that Horikoshi struck upon this combination of characters and thought through the interaction. Again, not wrong, not right, it's just kind of an empty question.
And of Deku's classmates, any one of them could have come to help out. Todoroki was not the only possible candidate. This is where deliberation comes in. There are established and narratively important reasons for it to be these two, and these two only. Ida is, fairly sneakily but nonetheless directly, established to be well off.
Fairly sneakily, but nonetheless directly. You mean casually and diegetically. It's not really sneaky, it's not being hidden from us, it's just not signposted and highlighted into oblivion. Anyway, you're making a point.
His family is a central pillar of generational heroism, and also filthy rich. His familial legacy thus represents an outwardly ideal heroic dynasty, which is the perfect target for Stain's solo crusade. By harming Tensei and accusing him as a vestige of the system's corruption, Stain threatens to destroy Ida's whole framework of what heroism really is, and also attacks a core institution of heroism at large. At the same time, he is not wrong. The Ida have gotten very wealthy off of a profession which pretends to be generally altruistic.
But you're wrong? Stain doesn't attack Tensei as a vestige of a rotted system. He attacks Tensei to get the rumor mill started. The only thing he says about Tensei is that he's a poser, in the same breath as he calls Tenya one, and he especially never said anything about his money. There's no elaboration on if Tensei was crooked or deceptive, just that he, like all the other heroes Stain attacks, isn't All Might. By all accounts, what we've seen of him indicates he's nothing but a stand-up guy and a genuine hero who Tenya is very right to look up to. The man was motivated to become a hero not because of his family's wealth or pressure, but simply because he thought the people who helped lost children find their way home were the coolest people in the world. While I can certainly acknowledge there's a discussion around pay in heroism, there's nothing indicating that Tensei was any less of a genuine hero while still benefiting from the rewards. Honestly, it feels like Ochako might be more central to that conversation considering one of her core motivations is to help fund her family's easy living. In fact, All Might himself might fall under the same scrutiny considering how much money he's made as a hero.
This is a conflict Ida struggles to internally resolve, a conflict which is as much about what it means to carry a legacy as it is about heroism as a whole, a conflict which leads him down the path of attempted revenge. This clearly cannot stand. He needs to be stopped, saved by someone who can directly empathize with the weight of expectations, legacy, and emotional conflict. Oh, hey, Todoroki.
But that's not Tenya's conflict. Tenya's conflict is his desire to avenge the grave injury of someone he loves, which blinds him to upholding the stringent belief in heroism he thought he had. His first action upon finding Stain is to attack him, not to attempt to rescue Native, and that was the learning moment for Tenya during that entire fight. He comes face to face with his own hypocrisy, and his struggle is overcoming that in the end, as well as relying on friends to help him in a time of need instead of being stupidly self-sacrificial. I wonder if that'll become relevant again later. Now, what's wonderful about Ida's arc is that he does serve as a great example for Stain, of how professional heroes can easily lose track of their codes and become unheroic by prioritizing their own selfish desires. But none of that revolves around his family other than the revenge aspect. Sure, they certainly influenced him entering the field, but like his brother, they weren't the reason. He idolized his brother as a heroic ideal, and for that to be felled in battle wasn't just a familial affront, but something that also hurt Ida's pride, for his brother and for himself. That's the beginning and end of it. These deeper discussions you're pushing here don't exist in the text of the story, or even in the subtext because there's no way to attribute intent to Stain's targeting of Tensei.
Shoto is primed perfectly to help Ida because his shaky relationship to his father asks many similar questions, but also because he has recently learned to overcome them slightly, thanks to Deku.
In spirit, you're kind of correct, but definitely wrong in practice. Shoto says very little to Ida about his family, other than making the rough comparison that both of their families have dark sides. Most of Shoto's in-depth comparisons are more geared towards himself, flashing back to a conversation we never get to see him have with his mother, and touching on his decision-making process for choosing his father's company to intern at. His outward discussions with Ida during this arc are largely supportive of Ida remembering the kind of hero he wants to be, effectively reinforcing one side of Ida's internal struggle and helping him pull through his issues.
So, through this specific, seemingly random combination of characters, multiple narrative ideas are paid off in ways that feel natural and believable, without centering entirely on Deku, but still being an indirect result of his actions. He saved Shoto, which allowed Shoto to save Ida. And as a result, not only do the boys survive, they walk away with an increased sense of responsibility and self-reflectiveness, which causes both change and turmoil in all of them.
Now, wait a minute. For one, far fewer narrative payoffs are happening than you seem to be leading us to believe. Any talk about heroic legacy or money-corrupting heroic action are left either only briefly touched upon by Shoto or alluded to by Stain, before he even attacked Native and met Tenya. So there's no resolution or payoff there revolving around these particular characters and those subjects. It's simply their heroic resolve that's been reaffirmed. And second, there is an issue with the natural and believable element of this plotline. It's a goddamned miracle that Deku managed to locate Ida, Stain, and Native in the first place, a complete fluke of luck. If he and Gran Torino had been 10 minutes earlier or later on their train, Ida would have been dead in an alley and Shoto would have been none the wiser. Fun fact, I actually had a third point here about how Stain kinda undermines himself at the end of his ramble by spouting off about reclaiming his hero status, but then I learned that's only in the official translation. In the original Japanese, the seemingly more accurate fan translations, the anime sub and the anime dub, he's talking about restoring the true nature of the word hero. Just thought that was interesting. There's a few translation flubs in the official English version of the manga that can lead to big impacts, and I wonder if that affected people's viewpoints of the MHA world.
So, we have preparation, the established narrative traits of these characters and events, which beckons deliberation, the specific positioning of these characters within events that allow their traits to shine, which in turn causes consequence, the behavioral lessons learned as well as the more critical look onto the hero's system.
Again, establishment, development, and resolution. And again, while this is certainly our first detailed look into the issues of the hero system, it's still more of an overview than it is any kind of deep dissection. That's what the rest of the series is for.
This example is a microcosm of how the majority of MHA used to function. By establishing aspects of its story and characters, sometimes explicitly, sometimes sneakily,
Ida's wealth wasn't sneaky. Stop saying that.
the series prepared a sort of itemized list of who cares about what topic and why. So then, when a story beat brings up ideas and themes that intersect with something pre-established, the series goes out of its way to have them link up and reverberate through the story. This structure is not revolutionary by any means, but it nonetheless made for an extremely satisfying reading and viewing experience, because it felt like you were being rewarded for paying attention and keeping track of who, what, and where, since that knowledge allowed you to predict and theorize in ways that felt tangible, less like you were grasping at straws and more like you were playing chess against the author and keeping up.
Hey, can you maybe go ahead and not use 8 commas in a single sentence? Maybe think about breaking those up for me? Also, again, you're really putting emphasis on elements that were largely left unconnected. Stain hates heroes who get rich off heroism. Ida's family is a rich family off of heroism. Ida has a family legacy of heroism. Todoroki has a family legacy of heroism. On paper, it's easy how you can see these things connecting, but there is no connection. Stain says nothing about money or legacy to Ida. His entire critique was that Ida was selfishly blinded by revenge. In fact, Tensei and Tenya are both clean exceptions to Stain's worldview from what we can see. Todoroki only mentions family once to Ida, and it's more of a self-deprecating joke at his own expense. There is no exchange about legacy, and there wouldn't need to be since Tenya's heroism isn't fueled by legacy, but admiration. There are conversations I could see them having and exploring different dynamics here, but they aren't in this arc, and they aren't, to my knowledge, in any of MHA. Also, I find it interesting that you highlight the ability to predict and theorize as a strong suit. Technically, this can be done with any story, though some do lean into it. MHA does like to tease some future plot threads, but I haven't noticed it quite as much as you seem to be implying. While fan predictions can certainly be good to generate buzz within a community to stir discussion, it can also be a double-edged sword. People become so locked into their pet theories and ideas that when the reality is laid bare, they find themselves underwhelmed. This is often because they've tried to read into everything a story has to offer, thinking any little detail will give them a hint of what's to come, and then that detail ends up meaningless. So it's an element where readers' mileage may vary, and could even set you back a few miles if you become too entrenched in it.
A story being predictable isn't by itself good, but a story being engaging and exciting to try and predict generally is. It makes you feel like part of the entire process.
What do you mean, makes you feel like part of the entire process? Like you're co-writing with Horikoshi? Maybe this is just a different mindset, but being able to predict certain things in a story doesn't make me feel any closer to the writer or feel any ownership over the story itself. I need some elaboration on what you mean here, because your phrasing here is worrying.
And when a prediction became fact, or even just very likely, you could revel in the possible consequences that plot point would have, as the story put strong emphasis on the long-term impact of its own plot points. From huge paradigm shifts like All Might's fight at Kamino to tiny mini-stories like Deku's hands, it always felt like every moment of the story mattered. In seeing these moments click together to create a web of narratives that was founded on diligent preparation, deliberate writing, and consistent consequence, made the story just very cool and interesting to follow.
I don't know what you're talking about. To start, All Might's Kamino fight comes very abruptly. There is little, if any, build-up to the fact that AFO is present at all. It was a spontaneous escalation that was in no way foreshadowed. Deku's hands, meanwhile, were just to set up the boy has been brain dead for half a year forgetting he has goddamned legs. It's treated as something he has to be mindful of and regularly is. He rarely, if ever, goes all out unless it is a desperate situation and the intervals between those moments are long enough for his body to heal. And yes, typically speaking, every part of a story matters. All the pieces contribute to the whole. I don't know why you keep highlighting it like this is MHA's secret sauce. It's Storytelling 203, sophomore year education at best. At worst, I learned this in high school in freshman year. Also, you're really married to this whole preparation, deliberation, consequence thing? You've even gone out of your way to shake up the adjectives each time for variety? It's not helping. It's getting repetitive.
And then it fell apart. Now, let's be clear here. This structure I just laid out wasn't 100% consistent all of the time. It was a core aspect of the series often enough that you'd get used to it, but that doesn't mean there weren't a few duds and non-conforming elements. In fact, not only did those duds exist, but they gradually became more frequent as we approach the arc that broke the series. A great example of that is Kurogiri, whose twist has all of its prep work and actual substance outsourced to a spin-off, and thus doesn't conform to the model we created.
That was supposed to be a twist? It never came across to me like it was supposed to be, like, at all. Sure, it was a twist for Aizawa and Present Mike, but for us it was more of I suppose a reveal? It wasn't like there was some big mystery built around Kurogiri, he was just a particularly powerful henchman who got captured. It was honestly more of a twist that he would be more plot relevant and not just a lackey for the villains, and I never got any indication we were supposed to be predicting this?
And there are numerous other examples, because at the end, this is just a model. This is me, a random dude, trying to make sense of something after the fact.
By enforcing on it a model that not only is poorly defined, not only is a mutilated description of basic narrative plot structure, and only exists as some kind of secret spice to storytelling in your own head. Am I understanding this correctly? I mean, fair enough, you're trying to make sense of something, but you could have at least done a little research on the matter first, couldn't you?
However, even so, these instances remain fairly rare and mostly concerned with smaller, less central parts of the narrative, while the heavy hitters still followed this 3-ingredient recipe.
Considering you know how critical Kurogiri becomes to the endgame of this story, you have some pretty big egg on your face for keeping this statement in your script.
In fact, its strongest example came right on the cusp of the breaking point. Dabi. I will just go out and say it. To me, Dabi's dance and its associated flashbacks are the last part of MHA's old identity. One final hurrah before everything changed. But what a send-off it is. So meticulously prepared that everyone predicted it years before it happened, and yet so narratively deliberate and impactful that it was still hype as shit.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but when you have only 2 notable characters with fire powers, both of whom are related, and you have a main antagonist show up using a fire power, everyone immediately assumes there might be a connection with that previously mentioned fire-wielding protagonist family. Especially when they have a presumptively dead brother that gets mentioned a quarter of the way through the series. It was well delivered, but you're overselling it a little.
Years and years of build-up and careful planning gave way to a stage where all the pieces, Endeavor, Hawks, the war, were in just the right, deliberate position for the trigger to be pulled and for the reveal to have massive effects on the already beaten and battered hero system. Dabi had been, for the last few months, shown to be so much smarter and much more dangerous than he let on until then, and he was ready to enact his revenge. It was this structure's greatest hit, and should have been another paradigm shift just like Kamino.
You're playing this up like it's some miracle of fiction, but it really isn't. It's good, sure, fantastic even, but it didn't happen the way you described it. Since word go, Dabi's been a mysterious and calculating member of the League, often acting in a command capacity when Tomura and AFO were absent, and never revealing a thing about himself while most members of the League spoke freely. His only stated goal was fulfilling Stain's will, but he never spoke his means, leading naturally to a mystery around that. His opening move at the training camp was to duplicate himself, target the students in remedial courses who were in a confined space where fire would be most effective, and attempt to kill Eraserhead. There's nothing about him that depicts him as anything but a dangerous and intelligent member of the League, and every appearance further insinuates that he's using the League more as a stepping stone for his own goals rather than a genuine banner he subscribes to. And what do you mean he should have been another paradigm shift? He was a paradigm shift. He was the paradigm shift. Sure, Tomura destroyed an entire city, but it was Dabi who aired all of the hero system's dirty laundry, destroying the reputation of the two top heroes in one clean strike. There is a reason the last fourth of the series takes place in a borderline post-apocalypse. Society collapsed. What more do you want?
It was delightful. But as we were getting ever closer to the breaking point, this did not last. And while the war arc went on for a few more chapters, the style already began to shift towards a new signature structure, one which to me has become synonymous with the arc that broke MHA. Villain Hunt. Yes, I know the official start of the arc is a few chapters later, but shush, this is my video.
I'm gonna go ahead and bookmark this for later. Why? Oh, no reason.
Before we even enter the main arc properly, things start changing already.
Hot tip for writing essays. Any essays. If you have to point out you're going to be starting your analysis before a certain point, you don't have to say it twice. That's just redundant. Please clean up your script.
After spending years to build up Dabi, going as far as hinting at larger plans beyond just his revenge, we suddenly get a conga line of plot developments aiming to ridicule and depreciate his character and his build-up. Not only is Genis not dead, Dabi has no contingency plan for this scenario, despite stating that he predicted this. Okay then.
But he didn't predict this. He wasn't making some grand scheme that would stop the heroes at every turn. He was commenting that the sheer talent, power, and numbers on the PLF side of the equation would overwhelm them. You show it right there. His plan did factor Genis in because he assumed Genis would be overrun if he somehow re-emerged, just like all the other heroes he presumed would be overrun. He, like many others, underestimated what Genis and the other heroes were capable of, like swinging in with a bunch of steel cable to lock down the city-destroying giant he'd been relying on as a mobile defense. You may not have noticed it, but Dabi's go-to method of power play is overwhelming force. In fact, it's unclear what his plan was before the PLF because all of his exposing my horrible backstory play was facilitated by Skeptic. Even then, the situation requires two things: overwhelm people with the horror of what Endeavor and the HPSC have done, and streaming Endeavor's humiliating defeat. That's it. That's the grand total of Dabi's plan. He's an intelligent person, but I think you're overestimating how much of a grandmaster chess player he is.
And before this had time to sink in, multiple things happen at once. Deku unlocks a new quirk,
which was set up back in Chapter 210 with all the other quirks he unlocks.
Mirio comes back,
which was set up when he lost his goddamned power. The only issue I have with that one is that our heroes knew about it and we as an audience didn't. This wasn't something we needed kept hidden from us until a dramatic reveal.
Compressed reveals he's the descendant of one of the big three villain lords and annihilates his own ass cheek,
which honestly is played at his own expense. It kind of plays a foil to the idea that legacy is actually all that important. In the same way several characters with no lineage or history become absolute game changers for their role in the conflict, someone who should be important is but a minor role who has to pass on his lineage because he can't accomplish it himself.
And All for One possesses Shigaraki.
Well, if you want to be technical, it's a merger, not a strict possession. But yeah, they've been teasing that plotline for a while.
More on all of that later.
Okay. Noted.
For now, with this salad of bizarre plot decisions, the war ends and we enter Villain Hunt properly. This prelude already clues us in on one of Villain Hunt's main features: its bonkers pace and general laissez-faire attitude towards honoring pre-established narrative elements and preparation. Deku is a vigilante now, so no time to lose.
Well, if you want to be technical, again, he's not a vigilante. Deku still has his provisional hero license, and he's still working closely with All Might, who is also coordinating with the top heroes. As for the other points, Yeah, there are pacing issues in this arc of the story, annoying ones at that, but the whole laissez-faire thing about honoring past narrative elements? You're going to have to elaborate on that one.
We race from set piece to set piece, with very little in terms of actual downtime. This also applies to some rather crucial stuff, with Deku's mastery of the predecessor's quirks being essentially entirely skipped.
This one is only partially fair. It was established in prior arcs that All Might began researching the quirks of the prior holders of OFA. He compiled as much information on them as possible once he learned Deku would be getting them, along with the sheer power upgrade already presented by the original quirk. So Deku has had time to prepare and pre-visualize how to use the quirks. We even see him training just in case he ended up getting Float. Considering the rate at which he'd been unlocking the quirks, having unlocked 1 prior to Jakku and 2 during, it was more than believable in a week's span he may have unlocked the rest and worked to put his knowledge into practice. Even more mitigates this thanks to the fact that the Vestiges are actively conversing with him now, giving him all the tips and tricks they know on their own quirks, expediting that mastery even more. However, I won't disagree that it comes off as fast. While it makes sense when you break it down logically, we're not given much time to process everything that happened in the prior arc before we're sped right into the new one. You're right that there was no downtime, and unfortunately, I don't see a circumstance where there could be. I've suggested before buffering the arc with a chapter or 2 to smooth out the timeline, during which we get glimpses of Deku practicing with or mastering some of his new quirks. But there's problems concerning doing that as well. It's an unfortunate quirk of the narrative that still functions. It's just mildly irritating.
Either way, while out hunting for villains that escaped in the very cool Tartarus prison break...
Oh, that's cool, yeah? No mention of the whole radio wave thing that AF Original and Tomurafo could use to communicate and coordinate that was only barely set up half an arc back in a roundabout manner? Or the ludicrous level of outward defense present at Tartarus that was only fully established in this chapter? Something that could have been set up far beforehand during our numerous visits to the island that would have made the villains overrunning it 10 times more impressive?
Deku spirals down mentally until his entire class shows up and subdues him, urging him to come home. While this is an exciting premise with balls-to-the-walls action, this is also the arc that broke MHA. And it does this by taking that narrative structure we discussed earlier and shooting it in the head. A constant factor to Deku's presence in the story is the state of his body. Much of his journey is determined by the various injuries he incurs and the threat of their consequences. In particular, we are continuously reminded of the severe damage to his arms and how the next big injury might paralyze them permanently. It is this threat that hangs over him for the majority of the series, pushing him to develop new fighting styles that are distinct from those his idol relied on.
Okay, and?
Again, we see preparation leading to a situation in which this character is pushed and directed in a deliberate manner, a journey dictated by the threat of consequence. And that threat loomed to become fact during the war arc, when an enraged Deku pummeled Shigaraki relentlessly using his already damaged arms. We are once again reminded, in the middle of this, of what might happen if Deku overuses his arms again. It by all intents and purposes seems like the series is finally pulling the trigger on a plot point it has been flirting with for actual real-life years. It is ready to make reality of the threat of consequence. Whoops! No, actually, Deku is totally fine, and his body has magically acclimated to the strain, and he probably won't have to worry about it anymore. Now, while the explanation given here is logical enough, it nonetheless represents a complete abandonment of consequence regarding this plot element.
You want to know what the consequence of that plotline was? It limited Deku from using the full power of One For All from the very beginning of the series, or else he'd have wiped the floor with just about every challenge he came across. It turned him into a glass cannon that needed to crawl and fight his way into being effective, and to explore other avenues through which he could exercise that power. The threat of permanently losing his arms was the check to warn him and the audience that he'd pushed past his limits and he needed to double down again to get creative with how he utilized his quirk. The consequence of this thread is Deku adapting, developing his body and skill. Now we're at the endgame and the villains are at their peak. The figurative gloves can come off for Deku and he can use OFA with mitigated consequences, more on par with the consequences we see his peers facing with their own quirks. You yourself call this plot point logical enough, and while I myself have some misgivings about the up until now unmentioned medical advancements, I can believe that Deku, through careful training, has given his arms time to heal to the point of being used again. The damage done to his arms are not cumulative in the way that you probably are thinking. Think of it like his arms have an HP bar in a video game. What you're probably envisioning is that when Deku injures himself, he permanently decreases the total HP of his bar, making his arms more and more frail as time goes on. In reality, what's happening is that every time he brings his HP to 0, he gains a wound counter on that arm, and if he gets a certain number of wounds, the arm breaks permanently. However, through his training and experience, the HP of his arms have been consistently going up further and further, meaning they can take more punishment before breaking again and giving him another wound counter. The more precautions he takes, and the longer he goes without injury, the more HP his arms will have, to the point he'll eventually have a body strong enough to just flat out wield OFA with no consequence, like All Might has.
What was the point of using Deku's physical condition as a guide rail for his development for all of those years, when the one time he actually oversteps it, the threatened consequence is just hand-waved away? The point is, who cares? We gotta keep moving. Look how cool Deku is now. Whoa!
No, the point is that even during his fight with Shigaraki, he acknowledged his limits and was aware he was pushing it, and stops using his arms when they're thoroughly expended. He goes on to use Black Whip almost the entire remaining portion of the fight. He comes to the edge of where his better developed body could reach, pulls back from it at the end of the fight, and it is explained that medical advances cover the remaining ground to keep his arms intact. And even then, he still uses the bracers developed by Melissa to allow him to access even more power without risk.
You could say that this is a tiny issue, that I am nitpicking. And you are right.
No, actually, it's not a small issue. It's the main protagonist's ability to use their arms when it's a show featuring vast amounts of combat. But carry on, I suppose.
But, A, small issues add up if they become common enough. Many bigger narrative problems are often built on small, insular but regular hiccups. And B, this isn't a one-time thing. Just like how our earlier example of the Stain arc was a microcosm of the series' general approach to structure and causality, this too is a condensed but representative glimpse of MHA's post-war narrative structure. This begins a trend of how most of the plot elements within the arc are handled.
Personal gripe here, can we stop calling these large-scale fights war arcs? I know it's common for anime and manga creators and communities to refer to massive combats featuring multiple major characters duking it out war arcs, but they're not. They're battle arcs. They might be contained within a war arc, in the same way that the battle at Jakku was essentially the start of the war and the final battle is the one to end it, but they are not, in of themselves, the wars. And I know there's probably an official source out there calling these things wars, but I will refuse to honor those on my own time. It just irritates me. Anyway, carry on.
Dabi's televised reveal was, based on its execution and just logic, supposed to completely erode and destroy the hero system, casting Endeavor and Hawks, two pillars of it, as irredeemable monsters. But instead, Hawks' guilt is weakened by Genis being alive, and Endeavor sees very little consequence from him being outed as an abusive asshole, besides some mean comments. In fact, the destroyed and broken world we see in this arc isn't really the result of the war arc at all. The chaos and destruction are caused by the prison break and the attack on the HPSC, both of which happen separate from the war.
No? Society doesn't just break down from a couple of prison breaks and a government agency getting bodied. Hero society, as in the social concept of heroes, is shattered. There is no faith that heroes can or will save anyone, and a not insignificant chunk of heroes have hung up their hats, leading to large swaths of territory being effectively abandoned to the villains. No one is sure heroes are even heroes at this rate. They may just be villains wearing hero masks, such as Hawks and Endeavor. In fact, much of the collateral damage is directly attributed to civilians getting their hands on support equipment and trying to enact vigilante justice themselves, leading to massive conflicts that leave entire blocks of city perfect for Fallout LARPing. And this is apparently the case across all of Japan. While the Tartarus breakout definitely didn't help, 6 prisons collapsing wouldn't cause nationwide damage on the scale that we are shown.
Not only that, but the actual post-war world of MHA receives almost no emphasis at all. Due to reasons we will get into, Villain Hunt will likely remain the only arc to really have had the chance to traverse this broken world. And it is only 37 chapters long. By comparison, we spend almost 200 chapters in a post-communal world, which allowed the weight of losing the symbol of peace to truly breathe and show itself.
You're factually incorrect. Even up to current, we are still in the ruined world seen after the Jakku City battle. That's over 120 chapters of content exploring the current state of things. The reason it may not feel that way is because much of the time is spent inside UA, which is noted to be one of the dozens of shelters scattered across the country, and it also happens to be where most of the civilians are. And for the rest, we're given pretty good examples for how they're handling the situation thanks to the Shiketsu student encounter at the start of the Dark Hero arc and the Shark Girl's harassment, both of which Deku intervenes during. It is, quite simply, a lawless world where the strong prey upon the weak, and the civilians who are actively distrustful of the heroes and don't want to enter the shelters have to band together in order to keep themselves safe. Everyone that's not a hero-doubting civilian or a villain are holed up in a shelter, or end up in one by the time the final arc starts to kick off.
Obviously, length is not how you automatically make a plot point good, but when we're talking about something as massive as a societal paradigm shift, time spent in that new world does equal emphasis. Kamino was a quiet devastation that allowed for extended exploration of how the system was failing. The war, by comparison, was a loud train crash, and its consequences should reasonably have deserved a similar emphasis, maybe even more as it was a much more dramatic change. Thus, much of the build-up and deliberation that went into setting up the war and its various potential effects on the world are either castrated to barely factor into the series going forward beyond isolated details, or hijacked by sudden, more influential developments. So, Villain Hunt is only marginally about the state of the world.
Shocking that an abrupt cataclysmic disaster where thousands, if not tens of thousands, were brutally killed and the entire concept of the preeminent peacekeeping force was torn to shreds led to just about every facet of society devolving down to basic survival principles, especially when much of that society was already on edge by prior disasters that you have cited multiple times already. You're looking at it like this is some new world state detached from what we'd seen prior, instead of looking at it like the gradual progression towards chaos that we've been witnessing since news of UA getting attacked went public. Are there problems with this arc? Yes. I personally would have liked to see a little more of that middle section, primarily what our main cast was doing during that time, how they were communicating with their loved ones, and how all of them were coping individually with the collapse of society. But is it necessary to have that? No, and Horikoshi has done a great job hitting the notes he needed to in order to expedite this world state.
What is it primarily about then? It establishes early on that it wants to explore Deku's mental state, and that Japan's broken streets are a sort of externalized metaphor. This also means that it would, by necessity, have to explore his relationship to All Might. Throughout the story, it is consistently brought up that All Might is an unrealistic standard, an unreachable ideal whose pursuit only causes problems. We see this in Endeavor, in the post-Kamino tensions, and, most crucially, in Deku. His self-destructive recklessness and gotta-do-it-all attitude are continuously and explicitly stated to be a direct consequence of his admiration for All Might, and the latter's encouragement of a simple, sacrificial heroism.
True, but there's also quite a bit that comes from inside as well. Nature, nurture, and free will aren't exactly at the heart of the story, but they do play a background role for just about every character that gets major focus. Deku is interesting in that his nature is laid out to us quite basically. He's someone who always wants to help, who always wants to save, even at great harm to himself. It's what impressed All Might at the very start of the series. Despite being told he couldn't be a hero by the person he idolized most, he still ran into a dangerous situation because someone needed help. Damned be the risks to himself. If this wasn't a virtue of his to begin with, and All Might really did inspire it in his youth, this point already has Deku internalizing it as a key trait of his person, removed from the initial inspiration, removed from All Might. The discussion in this arc isn't necessarily, is All Might responsible, but can Deku even be saved from himself at this point? There's also another question to ask. If it was solely All Might that influenced Izuku to be the way he is, then why is it only him that's like this? Other characters like Bakugo have also been influenced by All Might. We see that all throughout the series with multiple characters. But it's only Izuku that acts in this way, which implies it's something inherent to his personality and his way of thinking, or else Bakugo and Shoto and borderline half the cast would have the exact same ideals and mentality. They get different things out of All Might's symbolism due to personality and life circumstances, and that's the same thing for Deku.
All Might's post-Kamino story is in a sense his reconciliation with his mere humanity, and that his existence as a deific symbol did more harm than he imagined. Then, in the war arc, we see Deku at his most reckless, his self-destructive heroism turning him into a raging mass of tendrils and wrath, pounding into his enemy with pure, furious abandon.
But this wasn't his heroism driving him into a rage. This was Deku enraged that his friend had gotten impaled and people around him were being put on fucking death's door. It's actually the rare instance where Deku falls prey to the same vengeful instinct that Ida did back during the Stain arc. It has very little to do with heroism at this point, and it's the one moment that lands him in deep shit when he gets grabbed by Tomurafo. I mean, before this point, you have an argument, since Bakugo tells him to stop trying to do this on his own, which is a direct foreshock leading into Deku's entire Dark Hero arc. But not after Bakugo gets stabbed. After that, it's all just angry. As to All Might, you're only partially right. Certainly he's reconciling with his mortality. I'll be kind and treat that as a malpropism, even though you use deific later in the sentence. But his symbolism doing more harm than good isn't necessarily the truth. It managed to keep the peace and stability for around 40 years of time. Regardless what was happening under the shadow of it, that can't be ignored. The real thing he wrestles with is the fact that he didn't exactly prepare an exit strategy. He set up a society dependent on a singular symbol of peace, knowing full well he would have to stop someday. It's why he put pressure on Deku to declare, "I am here," so early in the series, something he would later have to apologize for putting on Deku's shoulders. Really, All Might's arc has been about a sense of helplessness. Like, he can no longer contribute to the battle against AFO and villainy. And that's been pretty consistent throughout the series with how often he's had to apologize. This sense of powerlessness goes as far back as the first chapter, with the slime villain, where he feels worthless because he had already wasted all of his time and has to push beyond his limits to save Deku and Bakugo.
This darker, toxic side of All Might's teachings is something the series had been building up for years, and Villain Hunt set out to finally explore its ramifications fully. Except it doesn't. We see Deku dirty, tired, battered, and bloody. We see him confused about his state of the world and his role within it, exhausted at the prospect of how much is riding on his shoulders.
I don't think Deku is confused about the state of the world, or his role within it. In fact, I'm pretty sure part of the problem is that he has solidly defined his role in the world, dedicating himself to destroying AFO and preventing the people he cares about from coming to harm, without any wiggle room for himself. I'm going to need some citation on the whole confusion thing.
He's grinding himself into a muddy, smelly paste, trying to do everything himself. But while all of this is a good showcase of how the outwardly positive messages of All Might's example have affected him negatively, and while scenes of him leaving All Might behind are pretty well executed, it overall doesn't actually go anywhere. Much of his actual journey is just skipped over, and the moments we do get to see only serve to formulate a placid, "Damn, some villains are more evil than others, that's crazy." And for as much as it revels in how broken Deku is, the actual solution to this years-long bad mindset ends up being 2 speeches and a bath. All very sweet moments, but they ultimately don't address the core issue.
I have never seen someone possibly miss a bigger point in my life.
They are saccharine declarations of camaraderie that aim to distract from the real problem. The fact that Deku is willing to kill himself if he thinks he can win through it. The arc in fact goes out of its way to never really address the self-destructive part of Deku, only his lone wolf attitude. The arc thus becomes more about vaguely teaching Deku to rely on others rather than to curb his penchant for reckless abandon.
Yes! That's the fucking point! That a singular symbol of peace, one man alone against the world pushing themselves to suicidal extremes, is not going to solve the world's problems. It is challenging the individualistic ideal of the singular Superman, that having a network of people to rely upon and share that burden, the burden being the whole thing that makes Deku borderline suicidal, is vitally important in making the world a better place. This happens first with Deku getting that very important wake-up call from his friends, and then it is extended beyond his friends into the general populace, because chipping in to help in times of need is something everyone can do to be a hero. It goes directly to how we wound up with Shigaraki, who was in desperate need of help, but was ignored by every civilian he passed. If even one person back then had shown an ounce of care, it could have possibly delayed, if not outright stopped, the world's greatest villain from being created. In fact, this point is further hammered home in the epilogue. The same woman that chose to ignore Tenko on the street makes a reappearance and ironically wonders if someone could have done something to prevent Shigaraki from ever existing. I don't know if you need a better example that the general populace also bear responsibility in taking care of each other. God damned, and you know what else? You just skipped over the climax of possibly the largest cumulative story running through MHA, Bakugo's apology to Deku. For someone who talks about preparation, deliberation, and consequence, you think you would mention this instead of hand-waving away as just some very sweet moment. This is literally someone who is very much on the same path as Endeavor, coming to terms with what he has to do in order to better himself as a person and to make the world around him a better place, putting others before himself and owning up to his own past mistakes. But you analyze none of that.
Thus, it ends with Deku trusting his friends, a far less interesting conclusion that is bookended by a celebratory bath scene that speedruns all possible character interactions in order to just quickly move on. The most interesting one, Deku talking to Uraraka after her emotional speech about him, gets the funniest excuse in all of MHA. She just do be sleeping though.
Is that a problem? It was very clearly exhausting for everyone involved. Pretty sure Deku also needed his sleep shortly afterwards. He passes out like only an hour after she did. While I wouldn't say no to more character interaction, I feel like the crew giving Deku and themselves some TLC is kind of the point of what they were trying to do in the first place. So what if that conversation ends up happening a few chapters later?
This haphazard conclusion extends to the other half of the subplot as well, All Might. While he gets a pretty great scene with Stain, his reunion with Deku is very underbaked, to put it lightly, turned into a quick gag that gives the two characters no room to actually explore anything that matters. This man had to face the reality that his careless attitude endangered his beloved pupil, and all we get from it is a joke. So this plot point too has all of its preparation and deliberate narrative structure devalued, as its consequences are confined to superficial and breezy moments that ultimately don't deliver on the potential these ideas promised.
Interesting. That's not quite the read that I got. Admittedly, there probably still is an element of what you describe, some level of guilt over having set Deku on this path, but All Might's core arc is his feeling of powerlessness to actually be of help. In contradiction to your point, All Might reflects that Deku is the only one who can bear the burden of OFA. That doesn't sound like someone who feels guilty for turning Deku self-destructive, it sounds more like someone recognizing the monumental task at hand and empathizing. Empathizing and being unable to do anything about it, which is an arc that ultimately concludes when they reunite and during the armored All Might fight against AFO. It's reflective how Deku has been gradually refusing help more and more as time goes on, and once his friends get his head on straight, Deku apologizes for having pushed All Might away and not realizing how vital he was in keeping Deku going. It wasn't turned into some gag, you just missed what the scene was trying to convey.
So, Villain Hunt fails to deliver on the two narrative beats it absolutely had to: Deku's mental state and the broken post-war world. It does that by giving neither idea time to breathe, condensing it to the bare minimum and always moving ahead at 500 miles per hour. Thus, it underdelivers on the consequences these ideas promise in their earlier stages, breaking the so far established style of MHA structure in favor of a style that heavily relies on just speed, moving forward, and being cool. These are the two big examples, but there are so many more. Let's list some, for fun.
Ah boy, here we go.
Hawks is established from the get-go as being defined by his quirk, his entire life being usurped by his job for the HPSC and by extension his prowess with fierce wings. He also immediately communicates that his wings are extremely weak to fire, thus setting up the danger of him having to eventually face Dobby, who is linked to him within the first chapters of Hawks' appearance due to their collaboration. This danger is made real as they do end up clashing in battle, which results in Dobby brutally burning Hawks, leading to a dramatic panel in which Dark Shadow declares that there is nothing left on his back. This seems to be a clear setup for Hawks having lost his wings permanently, as only his feathers are confirmed to regenerate, not the stems. But instead, they grow back almost like new. This further removes any consequence of Dobby's actions during the war and makes the event less impactful to characters that actually matter.
No, actually. Well, yes, I acknowledge that the panel with Dark Shadow is misleading, it's also incredibly vague. In both Japanese and English, what they intend by saying his back is gone doesn't really convey what that means. I know when I first saw this in the anime and later read it in the manga, I had the passing thought that he'd had his flesh burned away down to the spinal column. It kinda seemed to me that Horikoshi kept us in the dark because he didn't know what he wanted to do with Hawks going forward, and left himself an out if he wanted to write the character out completely or bring him back into the fold. But let's say he retconned a potential removal from play for Hawks, that it was intended to convey that he was out of the fight for good, but Horikoshi hard reversed to bring him back in. There was still a significant amount of consequences, borderline deadly, as we see in the final battle arc where Hawks has to supplement his feathers with artificial replacements, and even then he still can't keep up enough to prevent the people around him from getting horribly maimed. It's likely that Endeavor would never have lost an arm, and Jiro would have never lost an earphone jack had he not had this debilitating injury. And this is ignoring that it took him off the playing field during the crucial moments where society was collapsing. But let's take your analysis here even further and examine how you've characterized Hawks as defined by his quirk, which I don't believe has ever been the case. Yes, it did open many doors for him, and it helped him ascend into the top 3 faster than anyone in history. Fair enough, but that definition has always been the onus of other people. Hawks, internally, is much more defined about his results-driven attitude, his vision for the future, and his idol worship of Endeavor. He wants to make a world where heroes can relax. In fact, when AF Original removes his quirk from him, that's not the part that bothers him. His first and foremost concern is preventing AF Original from taking Tokoyami's quirk. If Hawks were to have lost his wings permanently in this fight with Dobby, I don't see him slowing down. I can easily see him slipping into a coordinator role for other heroes with the talents he's accrued using his quirk and acting in the field. Him being defined by his quirk is something that I think you have ascribed to him, not something he has ascribed to himself, consciously or subconsciously.
Endeavor's life has been entirely derailed by his perceived inferiority to All Might.
Not perceived. Actual. His actual inferiority to All Might. That's the point. You've said it yourself, All Might is an unattainable goal.
It is this feeling of never being able to catch up to him that led him down a dark, abusive path. A path which ruined the lives of his entire family and created a monstrous villain. In Villain Hunt, he discovers that All Might's superiority was neither inherent nor earned, and was instead a transferred power that instantly made him nigh on invincible and put him into an unreachable echelon by default, thus making all of Endeavor's life and suffering kind of pointless. Endeavor has, somehow, no thoughts on this. We are given no reaction, no payoff, nothing regarding what should have been a shocking moment that would have opened the door for some interesting characterization. All Might's story is inherently tied to Endeavor, and yet this enormous piece of info just doesn't seem to matter to NG initially. We are given the tiniest crumb regarding this dynamic one arc later, but by this point, it's too little, too late.
Or, now hear me out, he already recognized previously that his pursuit of All Might made him into an awful person who shoved that burden onto his family. The fact that it was a gifted super quirk doesn't change the metric. The quirk existed, All Might had it, and used it to become the top hero for over 40 years. It wasn't sheer power that Endeavor lacked when falling behind All Might. In fact, it's never been. It has always been All Might's presence and PR. The power helped him maintain that, sure, but even early on it's noted that Endeavor is actually the most prolific hero in all of Japan, resolving more cases than even All Might in a given day, week, month, and year. Even in the example you show, it's Endeavor wrestling not with the overwhelming power of One For All, but with his own internal weaknesses. The weaknesses we have been exploring quite thoroughly since Todoroki was introduced. Also, I need ask, how late is too little too late, exactly? That's a really annoying vagary people throw out there when they didn't get what they want soon enough. You've gotta dig that extra step so we know when it would have been appropriate to place it in relation to the other major plot and character beats the story needed to hit.
The arc makes it a point to show students out in the field compensating for their lost and retired pro heroes. Among them, we get to see two of the big three, Tamaki and Nejire, doing their part. Mirio is conspicuously absent, having in fact not shown up since his return as of writing this video. All the hoops the story had to jump through in order to bring him back prematurely are rendered even more ridiculous, as his non-existence within the story makes his role in the war even more pointless and frustrating than it already was. His subplot, and by extension Eri's, were rushed to completion only for him to now not matter.
Or, now hear me out, he was out doing work elsewhere. We aren't told this specifically, sure, but it is reasonably inferable with how we see all the other students at UA and Shiketsu behaving. If we see second years, Nejire, and Tamaki all out on patrols, it's not hard to surmise that Mirio is doing the same just somewhere else. Heck, we know the big three should have technically graduated by now. They are not required to work together 100% of the time. Also, what subplot? Him losing his quirk? That seemed pretty well settled. The man was determined to be a hero no matter what, hoped Eri could reverse his condition, and boom, we arrive at that point. I acknowledge, again, not the best handled in terms of pacing or conveyance, but it was resolved in a realistic way. What more did you want?
Gran Torino is dramatically impaled by Shigaraki during the war so hard the earth shatters beneath him, and then he passes on escape to Deku as he lays broken in the hospital bed. But he isn't dead. Or rather, the series just forgets about his existence, never actually following up on whether or not he croaked. This is so weird because it diminishes the weight and meaning of the cape, while also making Shigaraki look so incompetent that he couldn't even kill one old man, and there is no reason to just not confirm he died. What the hell?
Okay, it's somewhat fair that you're complaining he didn't die. We've seen younger characters go down from weaker blows. The caveat, though, is that the story and characters don't treat him quite like he's on death's door. After he gets hit, we aren't really given a chance to linger on it, and subsequent chapters treat it as if he has a chance of survival. I get where you're coming from on that, but also, wow, premature on that he doesn't come up again thing, considering his words are instrumental to Deku, and we cut away to see him still alive in the hospital 2 or 3 times during the final battle. As I noted earlier, at the time that you made this video, the most recent chapter you could have read was 357. You've missed out on quite a few beats that may have addressed some of your problems. Who knows? Some of your complaints could have been preparation deliberately positioned for maximum consequences, and you'd have just missed that and all of the meaning it contains by being impatient.
Dabi is continuously hinted at having a lot of insider knowledge regarding the HPSC and Hawks, with him shockingly knowing his real name. This, together with his adversarial attitude towards heroism and his obsession with Hawks, seemed to set him up to have some connection to the secret hero training program that keeps being shown in the background. This is later, however, revealed to be just him having a bunch of unnamed, never again mentioned goons which harassed Hawks' mom for info. The secret hero program is also never brought up again and remains a dropped plot point.
Okay, yeah, this is a relatively fair point so far. What? I never said MHA was perfect, and it is absolutely true that Dabi's way of getting his information was convoluted. This point, unfortunately, never gets elaborated upon. I suppose you could just say the MLA helped him out, but I kind of feel like that takes some of the bite out of Dabi's accomplishments as a villain.
Toga dramatically spits off from the league to pursue Uraraka and, after a brief scuffle, is reported missing separately from the rest of the league. This might seem like a setup for something interesting, but instead she just reunites with them off-screen. This isn't like story breaking, it's just plain weird. Why would you even bother having her split off and then mention specifically that she's separate from them now if it just isn't gonna lead to anything? Why?
It's a bit weird, sure, but I think it was just Horikoshi accounting for the fact she split off in the first place, and acknowledging the logistics of that. I don't think anything needs to be read into that.
Redestro, Compress, and Dr. Garaki all leave the story with seemingly no further plot relevance to be had. They are arrested and not mentioned again thus far. Even as the villains attack and break open 7 prisons all across the country, none of these 3 up to this point fairly relevant characters are given even the briefest mention. Again, not the end of the world, but just bizarre.
They're in prison, what more do you want them to do? We're given what I think are superfluous scenes featuring Compress and Garaki in jail during the final arc. I think it's pretty logical to assume that, with the breakouts happening not even a day after the Jakku battle arc, there wasn't any time to get them both into a prison proper by the time they could have been freed by the prison breaks.
Overhaul is broken out of prison, which immediately screams relevance. He was the main villain of a massive arc in the past, after all.
I'm not quite sure about that. Depending where you pin its start, the Overhaul arc could have started anywhere between chapters 123 and 128, and ends around chapter 162. That's at most 39 chapters of relevance, and while I won't call it small, I won't call it exceptionally massive either. I also don't have the highest opinion of that arc like so many in the fandom do, but that's a topic for another day.
Even unarmed, his reintroduction into the story should bring with it something at least. Instead, he bumbles about and is captured again without doing a single thing. Even Deku's speech to him isn't really anything of note. So, what was the point of breaking him out in the first place? Who knows? The series definitely doesn't.
Oh, we know the purpose. He was acknowledged to be a prop for Lady Nagant, a tool to both correctly ID Deku and a last-ditch measure to ensure victory if she needed to pull a trump card. From a thematic perspective, he's actually carrying quite a bit the more you think about it. For one, he represents the utter destruction of the Yakuza and all other traditional organized crime when stacked against AFO, a broken shell of a man who's clinging to the last desperate dregs of his loyalty to keep him barely afloat. For two, he's positioned to prove that Lady Nagant hasn't actually abandoned her heroic ideals, merely they've been buried by the cruelty she experienced being an HPSC stooge. She helped him out of the prison and actively took care of him before learning he knew Deku, and after that, when she tried to kill him as a distraction for Deku, her aim was intentionally off to spare his life. Combining this with how she could have actually killed Deku outright at the start of the fight, Deku manages to figure out that she's still got that heroic spark deep down. And it contributes to point number 3, which is to highlight Deku's own heroic virtues in the face of the world collapsing, willingly saving not just Nagant's life, but also a former bitter enemy, and even going beyond that to fulfill Nagant's promise to Overhaul. Now, a complaint can be lodged that he lacks any agency, that's true, but considering his entire organization is either arrested or scattered, he has no access to his own quirk, and he's attached at the hip to an incredibly powerful assassin, I don't see him doing much else in this arc. Update, we got his epilogue chapter while I was recording. Nothing much has changed, only that Deku saw through his promise so Chisaki could see his boss one last time. This further rounds out his arc, that he overstepped his bounds and ended up destroying everything he had been hoping to preserve. So yeah, Chisaki is the final dying gasp of the Yakuza in this setting. A desperate, broken man. And one Deku still shows mercy and honor towards, further hammering home the kind of hero Deku is.
The common trait all of the mentioned and the numerous unmentioned examples have is their priority.
Well, those unmentioned examples are certainly a nice way to pad your argument, aren't they? Unfortunately, I think I've mounted fair enough counterpoints to your largest issues, and the ones I ceded most on were relatively small by comparison. It'd be great if you mentioned the remaining examples, so at least I have a barometer of whether you just chose poorly or if you're barking up the wrong tree 90% of the time.
Move forward to the next cool moment at all costs. No matter what pre-established subplots or character motivations may weigh it down, the narrative just has to keep moving no matter what. Things like Hawks' wings or Endeavor's opinion on One for All are just distractions from what matters, moving forward and being exciting.
What does that mean? Genuinely pause and think about it for a moment. What does it mean to move the plot forward in MHA? MHA has always been an incredibly character-driven narrative. It's rare there is a force of nature at play that isn't given some personality, drive, or narrative agency. Every storyline is started because one or more characters want to accomplish a goal, and the remaining cast have to react to that goal and the method of obtaining it. It is the characters who move the main storyline forward, and most often it is their growth as people that shunts it in one direction or another. This cannot be ignored, and yet you're treating it as if the narrative is moving forward without the characters being directly involved, that everyone is being dragged along for the ride, when in reality it's the other way around.
This central attitude continuously detaches and diminishes the concept of consequence within the various plot elements, and turns the series into a fast and thrilling fireworks show at the cost of ignoring many of the underlying ideas and deliberate prep work that made the series what it is.
Or maybe the things you thought were deliberate setups weren't. You were off base when covering the Stain arc, completely wrong when covering Endeavor and the Dark Hero arc, and only partially correct on Hawks. Have you considered that not everything is leading up to a Dobby-level plot twist? That not everything is going to dive into a deep dissection of the human psyche?
This dogmatic devotion to always moving to the next cool thing reaches its most hilarious extreme in chapters 316 and 317. In 316, Deku and a gaggle of pro-heroes locate and infiltrate a mansion said to be one of All for One's hideouts. Unfortunately, the mansion is rigged, and the chapter ends on a cliffhanger as the entire house explodes with our boys inside. They obviously can't die, plot armor, but naturally, chapter 17 starts with an exciting montage of Deku saving the... No, wait, sorry, I had the notes muddled up. Chapter 317 starts with all of them fine, sitting in a warehouse, acting as if nothing happened besides briefly mentioning that Deku saved them thanks to Danger Sense. What would have been a great opportunity to show off Deku's mastery of his abilities, as well as justify the respect the pro-heroes have for him, is entirely shafted in order to move forward once again. The explosion simply didn't matter and was just another cool cliffhanger. This isn't the arc's greatest sin by any means, but its blank-faced absurdity and nonchalant pace make it extremely funny, like something I'd expect out of Family Guy.
On the face of it, you're not wrong. It's a very abrupt transition between chapters, and I actually agree it's one of the most uneven plot beats in the entire series. That's absolutely fair, but you're wrong on every other account. For one, we know the heroes have great respect for Deku and his ability, though more importantly, it's respect for his resolve. We don't need a thrilling action scene to establish that, but the explosion did matter. The entire scenario was a trap devised by AFO, not to kill Deku, but taunt him and firmly establish that no matter what Deku does, AFO is always one step ahead of him. AFO's mockery, turning All Might's words against Deku, is what finally gets him to crack and stop taking care of himself, distancing himself from the entire task force of top heroes. Also, I need to point out, this dogmatic devotion to always moving to the next cool thing reaches its most hilarious extreme in chapters 316 and 317, and this isn't the arc's greatest sin by any means, are contradictory statements. I get what you wanted to convey, that this isn't as damaging to the overall plot as your appraisal of Endeavor or Hawks or the 1A speeches, but it still comes off as just poor writing.
But it's not just consequences that Villain Hunt diminishes. In some cases, it manages to muck up preparation and deliberation as well.
Oh my god, please stop saying preparation and deliberation, you are driving me into an early grave.
And wouldn't you know it, confined within Villain Hunt is a secondary mini-arc that shows us an extreme example of how this new structure can backfire and fail on basically every front imaginable. Now, before I get the usual smug comments, I am aware that some consider this an arc entirely separate from Villain Hunt, and I think that's fair. but for the purposes of this video, I will be treating Stars and Stripes as an attachment to Villain Hunt, because I can and you cannot stop me.
Really now? The Dark Hero arc comes to a pretty definitive close around 326-327, with Deku's arc at this point in the story rounded out and everyone settling into a brand new status quo, all before setting out into the final battle arc. Also, fuck you, watch me. There, see? Even corrected the name for you. You're welcome.
As the conflict in Japan is heating up, the country requests foreign help, which stalls at the bureaucracy of the UN. The #1 US hero, Star and Stripe, takes a platoon of jets and heads to Japan on her own, as she feels she owes it to All Might, who saved her when she was a young child. All for One and Shigaraki take this opportunity to face her, as her quirk, New Order, needs to be either stolen or destroyed before All for One's plan can succeed. Let me say right out of the gate that this fight is awesome. Some of the coolest panels in the series, and as far as premises go, a fight on top of fighter jets in the stratosphere is pure peak fictionium. If rule of cool were all that matters, this mini-arc is fantastic. Unfortunately, we are cursed with frontal lobes, and thus must have these pesky things called thoughts.
Unfortunately, you've only had about 5 good ones through this whole video, but please continue.
Like, for example, what the point of this arc was.
Simple. It was to nerf Shigaraki's capabilities, get the X-66s over to Japan, prevent an influx of foreign heroes to assist Japan, delay the final battle, and cause untold damage to the internal ecosystem of AFO's quirk. We'll see here shortly that he doesn't see it that way, but these are the lasting consequences of this fight.
The Stars and Stripes arc sets out to essentially solve 2 issues. For one, it explains the absence of international action in the next big war. As the next fight with All for One looms, the series seemingly wants to avoid having to utilize foreign heroes in battle, so it needs a way to explain their absence, which is done by having Star's defeat scare off any international support.
Oh hey, that's accurate! Good on ya! Kinda worries me you only have 1 more in the chamber considering the 5 I listed, but we'll see where you go with it.
And secondly, the arc endeavors to address New Order, Star's quirk which is literally plot-breaking, an ability that can effortlessly rewrite the rules of reality.
That one, not so much. Firstly, we had no idea New Order existed before this point. We hadn't even really heard much of anything about foreign heroes, just that they existed. So this plotline must then serve a different purpose than to get rid of itself. You're also really playing up how powerful this quirk is, especially when New Order has some pretty effective limitations on it that require smart application and juggling. It's incredibly powerful, but it's proven here in its introductory fight that it has significant limits when fighting against the upper echelon of quirks.
The story can't progress without dealing with this power, as its continued existence would result in an instant win for any side that has it.
And you'll maybe notice that, despite it existing, Tomurafo didn't end up losing here. I wonder if that indicates anything.
It would kind of be a time turner like in Harry Potter, so to speak. An element that should be the instant solution to anything, and anytime it isn't on screen, you should be asking, why aren't they using New Order? So clearly it needs to somehow be dealt with.
Well, for one, the time turners in Harry Potter don't allow people to change fixed events. If you confirm someone dies, you cannot travel back and prevent them from dying. It's a fixed, stable timeline, so the most you could get out of it is gleaning new information or otherwise acting in events in such a way that you were always intended to have interacted with them. It's called a bootstrap paradox. Then you get into the heavy regulation by the government and the destruction of the whole lot to prevent Voldemort from getting them. It's a pretty piss-poor comparison to an ability that can rewrite physical reality.
So, the arc sets out to solve 2 problems and gets rid of both of them. Good writing 101, right? Yeah, except neither of these problems needed solving. And that is because neither of them existed before the arc brought them up. The presence of international hero associations has always been light in MHA, to say the least. What little we did hear of the outside world continuously painted the picture of disharmony and overall bureaucratic stagnation, with no nation seemingly being able to agree how much agency and authority heroes should have.
This is a faulty assumption. Just because other nations can't agree universally on the authority heroes should have, doesn't mean there won't be nations that have a firm belief on either end of the spectrum, from totalitarian to laissez-faire. And within those different systems, they might be willing to take action outside of their nation's borders, both as governments and as individuals. It's regular practice for nations to lend each other aid in time of disaster, ostensibly for philanthropic reasons, but in reality it's a careful game of favors and backroom dealings. This goes for wars as well, and AFO's uprising and the subsequent collapse of society would be seen as an international humanitarian crisis, and aid would be in transit before Midnight's body went cold. Accounting for this application of real-world logic is actually very smart on the part of Horikoshi, and I'm almost certain is probably informed by the numerous disasters that have befallen Japan in the last 2 decades.
This alone is already a good enough base to counter the potential question of where are the foreign heroes during the big fight. The idea that the UN Council will be too slow to react in time is by itself perfectly reasonable.
Yes, it is reasonable to believe that the UN would be slow to respond, but individual countries aren't, and if you refer to real-life examples, many countries with alliances pledge aid, supplies, and yes, personnel, long before the UN can get their grubby hands into it. And it just so happens that Japan has quite a few allies across the globe. At least in current times they do. It has been 200 years, but by all accounts, it seems the political landscape is pretty similar to how it is today.
Additionally, All For One mentions that his uprising has caused all of his former associates across the globe to raise hell, meaning that nations are now concerned with their own domestic issues.
Which would certainly deter some nations, but not all, and certainly not every hero who wants to go rogue. There's a whole conversation to be had if that in itself is an unheroic act, but it can't be ignored, it would happen in this scenario.
Both of these were perfectly fine explanations as to why international help would be unavailable. The entire idea of foreign heroes going rogue and helping Japan is only introduced by Star.
She is an example of a thing that is going to more than likely happen with other characters like Salam. You pretend like there won't be outliers that decide to go aid people they consider colleagues, friends, or hell, just innocent civilians being swept up in a crisis. I think when you have a major disaster on a national scale, being concerned with justifying why there's no aid coming into the country is a pretty smart move, especially when it ends up covering just about all the major bases.
And her quirk, New Order, that absolutely needed to be dealt with? It is not mentioned once before the fight starts. Star herself isn't either, as she's very sloppily retroactively given an identity in a movie-exclusive extra.
It's certainly true that New Order isn't mentioned until this fight, and we're given reasonable justification why thanks to US security concerns. It's only relevant now because Star is en route to Japan. But I want you to think, if it was created specifically for this arc, maybe there's more to it than just serving as an extra straw man for Tomurafo to knock down. Also, I'm not really sure it's fair to say she was sloppily shoved in. You could remove the reference to the movie altogether if you really wanted. That's more or less just a small Easter egg for people who liked the films. The more important aspect of her backstory is that Kathleen was a child rescued by All Might who grew up to idolize him in much the same way Deku did. Star went all in on the symbolism of All Might and his methods, and while it was enough to seriously wound Tomurafo, it still resulted in her own death and a consolation prize. It acts as a foil to Deku, who we've seen progress from copying All Might early on to slowly evolving his own style, methods, and beliefs. He's someone who inhabits the spirit of All Might while refining it further into a pure understanding of heroism. And this is all ignoring the dramatic foreshadowing of Deku being forced to sacrifice OFA in order to achieve victory. Star is integral in setting up the final arc for Deku, as well as the final status quo.
So, this arc is so ultimately pointless that the only narrative solutions it offers are to problems it invented in the first place.
Yeah, we'll just casually ignore that Tomurafo almost completely bodied every major hero and Deku in one bout while only 75% complete. Him reaching 100% completion wouldn't be a thing that needed to be addressed at all. What are you talking about, silly?
It is built on no foundation other than the haphazardly manufactured issues that didn't exist 5 seconds before the arc starts. It is the definitive rejection of the series' original structure. There is no preparation, as all possible connections to pre-established story facts are ignored in favor of just making shit up. There is no deliberation, as no one involved in this arc intrinsically needed to be there, since their reasons for existing in the situation are entirely fabricated as the arc goes on. And consequence, the final piece of the trifecta? The story goes through absurd lengths to make sure this fight didn't matter.
Now, hear me out. I have a very serious question for you. While I would have loved for characters like Star and Stripe to have been established previously and developed more thoroughly, ask yourself if they needed to be. Genuinely, is the story not allowed to introduce new elements even this late in the game? And stop it with the lack of consequence thing. There were plenty of consequences to this fight.
New Order messes around a little, but disappears and only destroys a handful of quirks that are non-essential to All for One's plan. And that's it.
How do you know they were non-essential? For all we know, Star deleted one of All for One's best quirks, and we would have been none the wiser. The man has dozens, if not hundreds of quirks. Do you think that cutting down that number isn't important in removing options from the table? I'm just saying, Reflect was pretty goddamn useful in staving off lasers, and wouldn't you know it, that becomes relevant in the final battle. AFO himself describes the situation as dire, so much so that Tomurafo had to rush to expunge it from his system before he was destroyed completely.
This omission of relevance is so baffling that the series managed to confuse numerous translators into accidentally giving it importance. Both official Spanish translations and some English fan translations have All for One note that this moment is a delayed effect of New Order. This is false. The proper translation has him specifically say that not even New Order could do this. Star is so thoroughly removed from the concept of consequence that her only posthumous influence over the plot is an annotation about how useless she was, spoken by the guy she was supposed to stop.
There is nothing in that scene that says that she was useless. In fact, I would argue the damage New Order did to AFO's Vestige Realm led to this moment. It's established early on that AFO needs to maintain firm control over the personalities that reside within the quirks he steals, and we see he does so through force. When New Order enters his body, we have no idea how that affected the quirk's entire ecosystem. Sure, it didn't achieve the level of what happens later in the Quirk Rebellion, that's literally what AFO says, but that in no way precludes the New Order massacre as a contributing factor to AFO being too weak to keep his Vestige Realm in order. And we know it had at least some effect on that level because the speech given by Vestige Star manages to crack all the way down to Tenko. And my suspicion is amplified in Chapter 413, when it's very clearly pointed out that Star's embers still haunt Tomura. Admittedly, this could have been a later decision Horikoshi made to retroactively justify his choices with the Star arc, considering the two arcs are almost 60 chapters apart. But we have nothing to indicate that one way or the other, and it's not like it contradicts anything that I'm aware of. Now, I know by this video you didn't get to this chapter, that's simply how time works, but it's a great highlight of your impatience to wait out plot threads and see how they completely play out. It's also a great highlight that you don't understand the nature of the preparation, deliberation, and consequences you so champion. Trying to put this in your terms, Star was a preparation that was deliberately lost to use New Order to damage Tomura and AFO, leading to long-spanning consequences down the line. In actual terminology, and because that sounded like gobbledygook, Star was established so she could die and lose New Order to AFO. This then developed into the fight between Tomurafo and Star, and that resulted in the damage to AFO's Vestige Realm, Quirk Pool, and body, thus permitting our heroes more time to plan. And in these later chapters, the final consequences of Star's inclusion have come home to roost, with the lingering weakness of AFO's control over the Vestige Realm and the freeing of Tenko. In your rush to proclaim MHA as bad now, you have put the cart before the horse and deprived yourself of later context. I'm not saying there's not problems here, but you're making this out to be far more cataclysmic than it really is.
Oh, speaking of, we should probably talk about Potato Man. All for One is the worst thing to happen to MHA. I'm sorry, I know people get very mad at me every time I say it, but there's no two ways about it. He sucks.
Bold opening proclamation. Let's see where you take it.
If there's one single element that has derailed MHA's structure and story the most, one guy that can be single-handedly blamed for what we have now, it's this ballsack-looking fuck. Within his original appearance in MHA, All For One held a wonderfully elegant narrative position. Him and his counter, All Might, represented the old guard, titans of a bygone era where singular titans could actually exist in the first place.
Oh, are we acknowledging that the modern era needs a more diffused net of heroes to maintain peace as opposed to a singular monolith of justice? Because you dismissed that notion as a sweet moment that had nothing to do with solving Deku's problem like 10 minutes ago.
All For One was, like All Might, a crumbling monolith. This mattered because much of MHA's story seemed to focus on the idea of passing the torch, as All Might sought to leave the world in the hands of someone who could maintain what he had built. This reveals itself as ultimately futile though, as All Might was an unrealistic perfect hero that no one could replace. Thus, the modern era has to produce a modern idea of heroism, and the unity between public and hero.
You know what's interesting here? AFO isn't a hero. I wonder if that might be important.
Through All For One and Shigaraki, this transitional conflict is mirrored on the villain's side. All For One is a perfect, unyielding evil, and Shigaraki's generation must find a way to move on from the legacy he left behind.
No, actually. I can't recall a single time where AFO was pushing for anyone to move on from his own legacy. In fact, he seems pretty obsessive from the very start in molding Tomura into his own definition of a perfect villain. He gave Tomura his own name, for Christ's sake. Did that not throw up any red flags for you? He has never been like All Might, who has only encouraged Deku to find his own path.
It was a very cool thematic link that gave the story a strong direction and identity, especially considering that MHA itself, having started only shortly after the immensely popular Naruto ended, was also extra-diegetically about taking up the mantle of an older, greater master and trying to become its own thing in the wake of that series' legacy.
And yet, when MHA tries to do something different and become its own thing, you seem to not like it. I think there might be some irony in here, and possibly some recursion because this is poorly explained, especially for someone like me who has only passing knowledge of Naruto.
Now, the thing about transitional narratives is that they actually have to transition. The entire idea of passing on the torch hinges on that torch actually being passed, which means that the old needs to eventually fuck off and give the stage to the new, so it can show if it lives up to the task.
Ironically, that is what the entire overarching plot is about. AFO is a curmudgeonly bastard who is adamantly rooted in the past, who believes that no one but himself deserves anything. He is a selfish child who takes and takes and takes, and only ever gives back when it benefits him. Sure, he's an adult, but that simply refined his ego-driven crusade. He perfectly foils All Might down to the letter. At the very beginning of the story, Tomura actually had quite a bit of freedom, with AFO being pretty hands-off. Comparatively, Deku was much more regimented, being guided very closely by All Might while building up his muscle and skill. But as the story progresses, All Might relaxes his grip on Deku and allows him to grow into his own person. Conversely, the more mistakes Tomura made following his own plans, the more susceptible he became to AFO's influence, offering Tomura solutions that would lead him down the road of thinking like AFO, as well as helping foment Tomura's anger, which was a necessary part of his plan. Tomura has been robbed of his agency without even realizing it, while Deku has only gained more agency as MHA has carried on.
All Might does this in pretty much the best way imaginable. One last hurrah, one last great fight, but then he's out. Not dead, but narratively greatly diminished in his influence. And maybe even better, he bows out too early. Deku is not yet ready, the world isn't ready, but they all have to cope. And it's that copium which leads to interesting choices and story beats.
You see, that's where I find this fascinating. You see this as All Might bowing out, which is not the case. You're right, this is certainly him throwing a burden on the Deku's shoulders, the world's shoulders, before anyone is really ready for it. But he's not gone. He's still a constant presence through just about every arc, and he's always at Deku's side, ready to help him. He still takes great responsibility for Deku's development, and is always proud to see when Deku has found a new route forward that even amazes him. His presence is still very much present and appreciated up through the very end of the story, to the point that he eagerly presents Deku a path to becoming an active hero again after years of being out of the game. I bet you have some pretty choice words about the Armored All Might fight, considering your mindset in all of this.
All for One initially also follows this concept, with his incarceration essentially removing his narrative agency.
Okay, I'm gonna have to stop you already because that was not something he necessarily wanted to happen. I know that AFO's dozens of sprawling plans and backup plans kinda make him hard to read because he's confident in the ultimate outcome, but he was fully intent on killing All Might during the Camino Ward incident. If things had gone his way, he would have soldiered on forward even faster to developing Tomura into the perfect body to steal One for All. The importance here is intent. All Might knew his time was up and abdicated the role to Deku, while remaining on hand as an advisor to help nurture the torch he passed on. AFO, conversely, doesn't. He is subdued against his will, clearly surprised by what happened, and has to rely on his backup plans to complete his overall scheme while his physical body is locked up in Tartarus.
With him gone, the story begins building up Shigaraki and turns him into one of my favorite characters in the entire series. More on that in this video here.
Your video doesn't have iCards? And annotations kind of died almost a decade ago. Am I supposed to just stare at this thumbnail awkwardly and osmosis your point into my brain? Is that your quirk? Because if it is, I might be immune.
But for the purpose of this video, what made Shigaraki an engaging character to follow is much the same as what made Deku engaging. They are both abandoned by their perfect, monolithic masters at a time when they are completely and utterly out of their depth. They are both insecure, incompetent, and now tasked with facing the future without the guidance of Superman and Satan respectively. These humble beginnings are what make their eventual growth so much more satisfying. Seeing Shiggy, a dumb nerd who could barely utter a coherent sentence upon his debut, stand tall in a crater of his own making, being crowned Grand Commander of an army of villains, is supremely cathartic in much the same way as seeing Deku dismantle Overhaul is.
Where do I even begin with this? There's a lot. Like, a lot. Let's establish some things. Deku was never incompetent, and the only time he ended up being abandoned by All Might was their initial meeting. And after proving his heroic heart, All Might took Deku under his wing, and hasn't once abandoned him since Chapter 1. If anything, Deku is overly competent, despite his insecurities, often breaking his own body in order to achieve positive results. Shigaraki, meanwhile, has never been insecure. In fact, it's quite the opposite. He's a smug, overconfident bastard at the start of the story, to the point he blames everyone but himself for his own incompetence. Any and all of his failures are swept away by AFO in an attempt to further manipulate him right into his own goals. So wrong on both of those counts. Nextly, yes, that's a word, I just made it up, throw it at a birthday party, have fun with it, and use it wherever you like. There is no thematic parallel between Deku's win against Overhaul and Tomura's conquering of the MLF. If anything, the greatest thematic parallel to Tomura's coronation would be Deku being saved by his friends at the end of the Dark Hero arc, and being welcomed back into UA by the civilian populace. That parallel being the singular man using might to subjugate everyone below him, versus the humble man being held up by many willing hands who want to push him forward. And you've just triggered something in me that I need to get off my chest. Doesn't the MLF qualify to you as a poorly prepared and deliberate plot point? Late into the entire story, we're introduced to a faction that has seemingly endless resources, hundreds of thousands of members, a sprawling empire across all of Japan, and hasn't been relevant to any of the major conflicts up to this point. Sure, we've gotten mention of Destro a couple of times, but on my first viewing of the anime, I completely forgot about him until his faction actually became a presence. It's very clear that Horikoshi wanted Tomura to have an army of villains under his belt, and this was the most expeditious way to do it. And you know what? That's fine. Despite some wonkiness, the story is allowed to do that. The issue is, by your own definitions, this should be considered a bad plot point, but you're here championing it instead. At this rate, man, I have to wonder how deeply you understand storytelling.
This also, again, plays into the transitional narrative. All For One and All Might seemed like they were perfect from the start, never really growing or changing because there was no need to.
That's fundamentally wrong. The first thing we get when Deku meets All Might is the definition of a don't meet your heroes moment. He discourages Deku, tells him to abandon his dream to avoid a fate like his own, and then Deku proves him wrong and reawakens the heroic spirit that's been dwindling in time with his body. If anything, between Deku and All Might has possibly grown even more, refining his own beliefs about heroism as Deku and all of 1A continue to prove his old beliefs wrong. He was woken up to the necessity of passing on his torch sooner rather than later, and later to the fact that the future wouldn't be centered around one perfect hero, but many excellent ones. That's some pretty impressive fucking growth for a guy who spent 40 years holding up peace all on his own. If anything, MHA is a story about how it's never too late to change your ways and help people in need.
This stagnant perfection sets them apart from their torchbearers, who must struggle and adapt in order to earn their position and lead their respective communities. This very elegantly identifies this new generation as more grounded, realistic, and by implication more productive and stable, as it isn't based on a single inhumanly perfect pillar to support it.
But therein lies the fundamental misunderstanding. AFO doesn't have any higher goals. He's solely self-focused, the ultimate evil in how singularly he thinks about himself. The heroes support a community that they want to protect, while the community is forced to support AFO, who subjugates them.
Deku and Shigaraki carry this narrative together very effectively because they take the stage, severed from their masters. And then All For One comes back, hijacks Shigaraki's body, takes over the plot, and becomes the actual, real final villain.
And thus continues the tragedy of Tomura Shigaraki. I want you to think back to Deka City, the MVA arc that you praised as Tomura's rise to power. Do you remember the reason he went to Deka? Giran getting kidnapped was the surface reason, but the underlying reason was Tomura and the League of Villains were making absolutely no progress in getting Gigantomachia under control, something they were required to do in order to gain access to Dr. Garaki's help and resources. And they were doing that under whose instructions? AFO's. In order to help perfect the merge, AFO needed Tomura to enter his own headspace, to gain the desire to take what he wants, when he wants, however he wants. This crowning moment you are hailing is the last of many nails in the coffin for Tomura genuinely being his own person. This is him biting hook, line, and sinker with his admission to Garaki's experiments a formality.
This right here might be the most frustrating single development in all of MHA. It happens right before Villain Hunt, but its real effects are only felt as Villain Hunt goes on. Suddenly, this character whose journey we had followed, whose rise we had witnessed, and whose growth had provided catharsis, is completely usurped by every mustache-twirling villain trope in a trench coat, trademark pending. Also, yes, this is All For One 2.0, not Shigaraki. All of his mannerisms and behavior is Potato Man, and in Japanese he even uses the specific pronoun unique to All For One within the show.
Interesting you had to highlight you were mistaken here, and in fact you completely obliterate your point by admitting you don't know what's going on during these chapters. Because in the very next chapter, chapter 335, we get confirmation that Tomura's personality is also bleeding into AFO through their connection. So on top of you missing the thematic point of Tomura's arc, you clearly missed a textually stated consequence of AFO's attempted takeover of Tomura. It's almost as if AFO has been positioned as Tomura's antagonist as well. Did you just not expect them to do anything with this?
Shigaraki is, a few outbursts aside, completely gone.
No, you cannot say that. Completely gone is a definitive statement which is contradicted by a few outbursts. If there are still outbursts from Shigaraki, then he is not completely gone. You cannot bury the contradiction by front-loading the sentence with it. How does this video have almost 1 million views?
Alright, let's try and be generous.
Oh, this'll be good.
There are possible benefits to this twist. Shigaraki being a likable and cool character that gets usurped by someone who is irredeemably evil feeds into Deku's desire to save Tenku, strengthening the specific plot point in turn.
Okay, I have a problem with this because Tomura is also irredeemably evil, and this comparison seems to ignore that. Like, holy shit, this man is a walking genocide and has killed hundreds, if not thousands of people. I don't care how likable and cool he is, that's a personality trait, not a measure of his moral character. I'm sure plenty of people consider Hannibal Lecter a cool, likable character, and he's a cannibalistic serial killer.
Additionally, as we were talking about transitional narratives, maybe the point wasn't that Deku and Shiggy would offer individual solutions as to how to move onwards into a world without their masters, but instead it was maybe about the heroes that will ultimately triumph because All Might was able to let go and allow Deku to lead the future, while All for One couldn't help himself and clung on way past his time, which might end up being his demise. In a way, this replaces the transitional narrative we've had before with a new one, additionally focusing on Tenko as someone to be saved rather than the main villain.
Oh, wow. You're actually catching on. Maybe.
While this would be a functional thematic evolution, it has several issues in my opinion. Here is the tough pill to swallow that no one online wants to talk about. You can write a technically competent, thematically coherent story and have it still fail if it isn't also enjoyable and playing to the story's strengths. Yeah, I think you can make the argument that All for One's takeover can fit into the narrative's established goals and concepts. But that doesn't change the fact that he's simply not as interesting to watch and explore as Shigaraki was.
I think they're both just different. All for One is effectively a god, or devil, among men, playing long, arduous games to achieve his ultimate goals. Conversely, Tomura is the living embodiment of rage-filled chaos, someone who simply wants to do whatever his twisted heart desires. It's really up to you which you find more interesting, and I find the fact that the two play off each other to be more interesting than one or the other alone.
When Shiggy outsmarted and triumphed over his enemies, it felt grand because he had a journey and a specific, humble starting point. Shigaraki's goals were founded on a tangled web of impulses, trauma, and ideas that stemmed from a brutal past, and it made following him exciting.
As opposed to a man who was born to a dying mother that he himself is implied to have killed by accident, was nearly eaten by rats, drowned in a flood, and then survived for years on the streets with only his little brother by his side. A man who became obsessively selfish because there was no one there to rival him in power, the ultimate monstrous version of nature versus nurture. I have to wonder how much recent chapters have changed your mind on this, because ever since chapter 419, the Tenko tragedy has been completely recontextualized for me. He is an artificial monster, someone who would have grown up normal and happy had his life not been injected with tragedy and pain. In some ways, I figure Tenko and AFO are supposed to be opposites. AFO was seemingly born selfish, while Tenko was almost purely nurture by contrast.
All for One, on the other hand, is just a bad dude. Don't get me wrong, I do think he is kind of funny in how he never lets any problem ruin his mood, and how the story wriggles and bends in order to have every bad thing ever originate from him.
Oh, the irony of that statement knowing you haven't read 419 at this point. But also, he has let things ruin his mood. Refer back to Star and Stripe and New Order tearing his entire inner mindscape to shreds. He was quite alarmed by that.
But beyond that, he simply isn't all that interesting. He has no real motives, no actual backstory, no personal ties to any currently active character. He is, in short, just not as Kino as Shigaraki was.
An interesting amount of impatience here, since we get everything you say is missing about AFO in chapter 407. From the backstory, to the motives, to the connections with relevant characters like the Vestiges and All Might. Now, is that maybe an issue of placement? Should AFO's history have been spilled to us earlier? Arguably, but you're also referencing from a point in time where Chapter 357 was the most recent chapter in the series to be released, which is at the very beginning of an almost 80-chapter climax for the whole manga. There was a lot going on that needed to be addressed, and exposition like that cannot just be shoved anywhere willy-nilly without slowing the manga to a crawl. Also, I hate that word kino at this point. It's been abused to death. Can we just kill it, please?
Something I've been saying for years is that the story gets less interesting every time something is revealed to be all for one's fault. My reasoning is that one of MHA's biggest strengths to me is its focus on grander issues that you cannot solve by punching. The biological inequality of quirks, the biases within the hero system, the resulting systematic abandonment, these are fundamental conflicts that require social action and awareness in order to solve, and thus fall out of the usual bracket of shonen problems, and that made them fresh and cool to see explored.
First of all, please stop with the run-on sentences. I already abused the Kamaki enough on my own. I don't need you contributing to that as I transcribe this. Second of all, none of those things you listed have at all been affected by AFO. In fact, those are the things that AFO preys upon throughout his entire existence in order to feed his army. Humanity, inherently, is rife with inequalities and struggle. People will find reason to discriminate against one another for any number of reasons, and AFO takes advantage of that to gain power. That's their position in the story.
This is also why Shigaraki was such a great main villain, because instead of being the mastermind behind all of those problems, he was their ultimate victim, their dysfunctions of this world taken to a devastating extreme. Beating him didn't mean solving the world's issues, which made the world feel bigger and more separate from our main cast. Beating him simply meant that you had resolved to take the first step. All for One, meanwhile, is the puppet master, and with every plot thread he gobbles up, more and more of these interesting issues are condensed into a man who you can very much just punch until he stops moving.
What the fuck are you talking about? Defeating AFO will not solve the world's problems. He's a parasite that thrives in tragedy, amplifying the problems in society to maneuver himself into more and more power. Much like his quirk, he needs to feed on the abilities of other people to sow his particular brand of chaos. Quirk discrimination, heteromorph discrimination, the flaws of the hero system, the flaws of the government and law enforcement, the moral decay of the everyday citizen, all of these things are present and will still be present in a world without AFO. He simply won't be there to exploit them. But you know who will? Someone else. Because that's how humanity has always been. He may be the pinnacle of villainy, but he was never the source of villainy, because the source of villainy is, and always has been, us!
While he didn't invent quirks, yet, his influence over the story and the series' lore tightens every chapter, and so, more and more of the story centers around beating this one guy instead of actually addressing the problems that created the rest of the rogues gallery.
What did I just say about abusing my Kamaki? I'm so sorry, Kamaki, I promise it'll be over soon. Personal affront to my keyboard aside, I have to ask where you think this story was going to go. Did you think the heroes would sit down with their villain counterparts and work things out? Izuku would get Tomura a suspended sentence and maybe some therapy. Dabi would be welcomed back into his family with open arms. Toga and Ochako could hold hands under the stars as they roast s'mores together. Actually, I like that one. Can I keep that? My point is, what route do you see for them to fix any of these issues? Giving marches and parades? Signing petitions? Or maybe they'd join the villains and start firebombing government buildings. The hero system is dead at this point in the story. Government is barely functional. By all accounts, the crooked society you wanted to see explored has collapsed, brought to its knees by the people that were exploited by it. What more do you want? Is that not the natural endgame of an army of misfits rising against the world that shunned them? And sure, AFO stoked that flame. Stoked. He didn't start the fire, it was always burning since the world's been turning. With his help, it has burned the world to ashes, and he seeks to build an empire within them. And the heroes want to prevent that because, for all the flaws of the old world, they know a world led by an all-powerful opportunistic conman will be a million times worse for everyone except his chosen few. Of course it's going to boil down to him at the end. And if not him, it would be Tomura, who would be in the exact same situation because his entire motivation after the MVA arc is to do whatever the hell he wants.
This collapses the larger, more inherent issues of MHA's world and makes them, in typical shonen fashion, dependent on just the bad guy, which robs them of that grander feel I just described.
Because that's not the problem they're trying to solve. We are way past trying to solve social issues. We are well beyond the point of no return for all of the villains.
Shigaraki was an interesting villain because he was the result of the inherent dysfunctions of the world systems, and defeating him was never going to solve them. It was just a step along a much harder, socially relevant path. All for One is, by comparison, uninteresting because he is the origin of those dysfunctions and boils their solutions down to just beating this old man very hard.
Where? Show me where all of the world's problems are laid at AFO's feet. Show me. Because not once is that ever stated. You pulled that right out of your ass because you can't explain why you prefer Shigaraki over AFO. And guess what? The more recent chapters back me up on this. Chapter 407 depicts the rampant discrimination of those with meta abilities when quirks first started manifesting. Was AFO, a fucking child, responsible for any of that? Probably not. I have no idea where you got this misconception that AFO was somehow the root of all evil, but it is bafflingly wrong. I also don't see how defeating Shigaraki is somehow a stepping stone towards curbing the social dysfunction we see in the world. It's already blown up. The social tension has completely exploded, and the country is at goddamned war with itself. Even if it were just Shigaraki running around, what does defeating him accomplish other than taking out the figurehead of the movement and stopping the war? Which is the exact same case with AFO. And once both of them are defeated, social strife is going to crop back up. Hell, it's going to be so much worse because, hey, the nation was just at war with itself. People are going to tribalize and fight over the scraps of their old lives. It's unavoidable, and there's not going to be an AFO in sight to blame.
So even if All for One cheating his way into the story is the point, that doesn't change the fact that he derails a much better character in order for it to happen. In general, something being the point cannot excuse the damage done if the point leads to an overall less enjoyable product.
The problem is, what makes an enjoyable villain is ultimately very subjective. I too was irritated when AFO reasserted himself in the plotline and overshadowed Tomura, but after staying with the series, I've come to really appreciate both of their roles in the narrative, and I actually struggle to see what the alternative could have been given their arcs. You haven't given anything other than a vague notion of what an alternative could look like, and even those fundamental concepts didn't exactly click with me. I think it's because the story has consistently been focused on exploring the nature of what heroism means, the contrast of what villainy is, and what it means to save someone. It's more interested in asking questions about not only the underlying principles of both sides, but also the consequences of those actions. Everything else, all of the sub-themes that you think Tomura could directly interact with, are just that. Sub-themes. They contribute to the overall narrative, but they are not themselves the narrative. I think this is a fundamental misunderstanding of what the story is trying to say.
But all of this is under the assumption that this takeover is technically and narratively competent, and that its issues lie in the fine print, which is not the case. All for One's reintroduction causes numerous structural, narrative, and even just logical problems.
Okay, you've given us 3 poorly defined definitions to work from, so let's set some here, shall we? Narrative structure, as roughly defined by Twinkle.com, is the framework a writer uses to tell their story, the combination of plot and story elements, such as characters, settings, and events, to help readers understand what is happening. There are typically 5 types of narrative structure: linear, nonlinear, interactive, parallel, and circular. These encompass the order by which events occur and are translated to the audience. Narrative, as defined by Merriam-Webster, something that is narrated, a story or account, a way of presenting or understanding a situation or series of events that reflects and promotes a particular point of view or set of values. And then logic, as defined by Oxford Languages, is reasoning conducted or assessed according to strict principles of validity. So there we go. I hope he's got a good explanation for why he chose these words, because there seems to be a fair bit of overlap.
Structurally, it removes Shigaraki, a very major character, from the story entirely, and thus, once again, breaks the three-piece structure we discussed earlier in the video.
Ah, fuck, we're going with that bullshit again? Really? Also, Shigaraki isn't removed from play. It shifts his role, that's all it did. It in no way affected the linearity, non-linearity, interactivity, parallelity, or circularity of the fucking story.
All the preparation that went into making Shigaraki a competent villain, and all the deliberation of how his journey paralleled Deku, are disintegrated and swallowed into the gullet of this sentient scrotum.
No, it's not! If anything, Tomura's a goddamn perfect mirror to Deku from the top down.
And consequences? Well, they are simply obliterated into nothingness. Remember Twice? His frankly shocking death and how heavy of a blow it was to the League? And especially how excited people were to see how Shigaraki would react? Regardless of if he would care deeply or reveal he doesn't give a shit, it would make for a defining moment for not just our main villain, but his relationship to his comrades, and could be used to catalyze different relationships within the League of Villains. Well, too bad we don't get to see that. Shiggy has, as of yet, which is by the way over a year, maybe already 2 years after Twice's death, not yet expressed any thoughts towards the loss of Twice. In fact, it is unclear if he was informed of it off-screen, or if he straight up doesn't even know. Shigaraki is left unable to express or signify anything, confined to rare, panicked responses that manage to slip through All for One's control.
Hey, you know, I kinda thought you said that Shigaraki was... what again? Completely gone? It kinda sounds like rare panicked responses that manage to slip through might indicate that there's something more going on here that you're simply refusing to acknowledge as a potential plot point and character beat. Also, great. At the time of your video, it's been 2 years in real life since Twice's death. In MHA, it's been less than a month, during which the country has been brought to its knees. There's a lot going on. And I feel for you, there could have been a powerful character beat to explore there, but I don't know if it would have contributed much more to Shigaraki's story if we saw it. Twice's death definitely builds into Himiko, Hawks, Ochiko, to a more limited extent Deku, and to a much larger central plot point later on, but how would it affect Shigaraki? He'd get even angrier. He's already so angry he can overpower OFA. I don't know what him getting any more furious at the world would accomplish. You've kind of maxed out the potential there in terms of plot relevance. We've already seen what he gets like when one of his members die with Magni's death at Overhaul's hands. While shocked, Tomura is surprisingly reserved and plans a thorough revenge. That's really it. I don't see how that'd be much different than what we already got, especially with the role that Himiko ends up playing in the finale.
By having his agency and ability to create and experience consequence based on his build-up stripped from him, Shigaraki's entire journey in the story prior is retroactively devalued and made kind of pointless.
No? Shigaraki's actions still ended up having massive, deleterious effects on the world around him. Even if he was manipulated into it by AFO, he still took those actions and is a willing participant in the villainy. The fact that he allowed himself to be groomed and manipulated is also a consequence of his own actions. Tomura did not have to go under the knife to get his powers boosted. He made that choice with almost no prompting by Dr. Garaki. Tomura losing his agency is ironically a consequence of his own agency.
This is also the case for that transitional narrative, as it is very much hinged on Shigaraki's agency.
So I'll reiterate, it was his own agency that wound him up in that situation. But I'll also propose that maybe you sit down and reevaluate what kind of narrative you think MHA is. If it no longer fits a given criteria, it may be best to step back and appraise the series with a fresh set of eyes. It may surprise you, but narratively, quite a bit of the story still holds up. But that's only if you accept it's not telling the narrative you want it to tell.
Not to mention All for One is just a guy who honestly no one in the story has any direct beef with. Sure, he is evil, but he doesn't really connect to any character's arc naturally, only by retroactively forcing him into Endeavor and Deku's stories.
What? Wait. Okay, Yeah, he was partially shoved into Endeavor and Toya's story. That much I can acknowledge, and it does irritate me a bit, even if there's a logical through line as to why. But first of all, he didn't provoke anything that happened until he came upon Toya's burnt body. He simply kept watch and waited for an opportunity where he could exploit the situation, which he has done with just about every other plan that he's ever had. And second, Deku? In what way was he shoved into Deku's story? If anything, Deku has been shoved into AFO's story. That's kind of been the point of OFA. It keeps getting passed along to new hosts, and AFO keeps chasing after it. There's been no secret reveal that Hisashi Midoriya never existed and was secretly AFO this entire time, or that Inko had an affair with a mysterious stranger, or Deku was some weird genetic experiment, or that AFO campaigned off the back of anti-quirkless hate groups in a targeted Aldera school district. To AFO, Deku is just a kid that All Might chose as the next in line, and to Deku, AFO is just the guy he's supposed to finally stop. Is it because of Dr. Garaki? The guy who callously dismissed Deku because he was quirkless? The best you could call this is a near miss for Deku, because if he had had a relevant quirk, he might have been targeted in some way by AFO. But the connection here is so thin that even when Dr. Garaki was finally captured, Deku never made note of it. Which disappointed me, but I don't know if it would have led anywhere since Deku has evolved so far beyond his anxiety over being quirkless.
Shigaraki, instead, was much more directly tied to Class A's journey and the overall decay of heroism. And while All for One was obviously the guy who set it all into motion, the actual personal connections just are not there. Class A's first traumatizing experience with the villains at USJ was orchestrated by Shigaraki, and he has personal relevance to them and especially to Deku, something that All for One simply lacks.
And this is, again, all based on the presumption that Tomura is gone completely, and not just momentarily suppressed within his own psyche. The emotional connections are still there, and you can't just dismiss All for One's involvement in the USJ attack. Much of the information Tomura was working with was based on what AFO told him about All Might's health. And even early on, it was clear that there was some level of grooming going on between Tomura and his master with how the two spoke to one another.
Then there are the logical problems All for One raises. As a mysterious figure with an unknown background, a nonsense end goal, and non-defined limitations to his powers, he is constantly surrounded by an aura of, why did he do that? And why didn't he do that instead? When you don't know why he is the way he is and what he can and cannot do, it makes most of his actions and achievements feel random, like an easy get-out-of-jail-free card for any narrative dead end.
Oh sure, it can seem that way in the moment, but if at any point the narrative delivers a clearer picture on his motives, background, goals, and limitations, you can go back and cross-compare them to what's already occurred and determine whether or not it's fair. This is that whole mystery thing in the word mysterious you mentioned. We know he can absorb quirks from other people, bestow them onto whoever he wants, and also use them for himself. We know there's drawbacks to using quirks this way, and oftentimes people's bodies don't actually adapt all that well to them. He simply offsets his effect on himself by keeping regenerative and healing abilities on hand that make him incredibly resilient to his own drawback. We also know there's an internal vestige space to his quirk that functions within his mind, spirit, something more metaphysical, and within that he contains the vestige personalities of the quirks he's stolen. Were it not for his sheer force of will and personality, those vestiges would tear him to shreds in revenge for all the evils he's committed, to their previous owners and to others beyond that. And we do actually know his motives. He wants to be the Demon Lord of Earth, a god among men, the complete ruler of the world. And while that's certainly a boring motivation for most people, I think AFO pulls that off thanks to the backstory we're given almost a year and a half after you made this video, which retroactively makes quite a bit fit into place. Perhaps I'm wrong, but there's not an issue to AFO that I can perfectly point at that isn't purely emotional. Not like, I don't know, Himiko's ability to vanish out of sight? Yeah, we're literally at the end of the story and we've still gotten zero explanation for what the fuck she does. The characters acknowledge it as something that distinctly isn't her quirk, that it's some method of hiding herself from people's perceptions, but we get no elaboration on the actual underlying mechanics. Ever. And it's honestly a thorn in the side because it's really damned overpowered. Yet, I don't hear you complaining about that, and I wonder why.
Dobby's rebirth is mysterious and raises questions about potential third parties, as he seems to have no connection to All for One's empire. Nah, never mind, it was All for One anyway, and everyone involved just so happened to never mention it.
But yet, this was explained. Dobby was only part of AFO's organization for a brief stint of time. Chapter 350 clearly lays out he was in a coma for 3 years while his body was repaired, in hopes to groom him into a backup for Tomura. When the grooming didn't take, and it was clear Tomura would be sufficient, Dobby was cut loose and was expected to die within a month. Instead, completely on his own, he survived. Now, how he got access to certain information, like Hawks' mother's location, I don't know, and I concede that's a pretty major failing of the storytelling that we haven't gotten that yet. As to why it was never brought up, well, you can figure out why Dobby never mentioned it, and as for AFO, what would be the point in him bringing it up either? There's also the, admittedly unlikely, possibility that between the name change, the appearance change, and the fact that they've had no contact since Dobby left the orphanage, AFO didn't know who Dobby was at this point. Then factor in the first time any of the League other than Tomura met AFO was at Kamino Ward, there wasn't exactly much time for people to catch up if either of them recognized each other. The only other person that we know knows is Dr. Garaki, who doesn't exactly get talkative about topics irrelevant to the situation at hand. In fact, it's a criticism that I level at the story. We didn't need this flashback. You could have just left well enough alone and left Dobby's backstory blank. We do get little bits worth keeping in there, both character and plot, such as Dobby revisiting his family's house and Garaki confirming all the backup plans AFO created for a new host, but I don't think any of that was 100% vital when I think the entire audience was really gearing up for the battle that happened after this reveal. It just felt impotent compared to his big proclamation from atop Gigantomachia's back. But that's besides the point. AFO is not responsible for the mystery around Dobby. At most, he's responsible for Dobby surviving the initial fire. That's about it. Everything else about him is 100% his own.
The UA traitor is a mysterious figure that hasn't come up in literally 100 chapters? Well, guess what? They were All for One's direct subordinates all along, and were just keeping quiet.
But yeah, we knew that. This is an even dumber version of the take I thought you were going to do. Like, I prepared a whole big rant and everything, and... I guess you could say your story didn't go the direction I was expecting. But don't worry. I know how to adapt. First, let's address that literally 100 chapters thing. Yeah, they haven't come up in 100 chapters because they were the direct subordinates of AFO. And where has AFO been? Tartarus since chapter 94, and he only escapes in chapter 297. That is 203 chapters where he had no way to contact his traitor at UA, which lines up perfectly with the USJ and the training camp. Them keeping quiet about it, thinking they dodged a bullet, makes a lot of goddamn sense. And you might be asking, why didn't AFO pass along the ability to contact them to anyone else? That creates a fault line in the spy ring. Minimizing the amount of people you need to act as middlemen reduces the threat of the entire spy ring collapsing. AFO managing all of his spies on a personal basis was probably one of the shrewdest decisions he ever made.
As discussed earlier, this shrinks the world dramatically, because everything starts swirling around this one guy.
But we knew about the traitor since the USJ. This was a major pre-established plot point. I don't see at any point how you could have been convinced the traitor wasn't connected to the main antagonist. It kind of felt like you just threw that point in there to pad your argument. The same goes for Deku, which leaves you with Dobby, who is also a very wobbly point to stand on because AFO only played a major role in one aspect of Dobby's life without affecting the others.
But it also begins turning All for One into a punchline, a joke character that can at any point just say, "I did that," and take over any plotline in the story.
Let's put aside the fact that he's lived for over 200 years, and it's not surprising he'd be involved in a lot of major events, especially considering his endgame. If we're just looking at the immediate effect he has on the main cast of the franchise, his grand total involvement with events that we are aware of are as follows. Grooms Tomura for his next host, rescues Toya from death, works closely with Dr. Garaki, who, unrelated, works as an actual doctor and at one point had Deku as a patient, recruits spies to infiltrate locations he's trying to, infiltrate, and that's about it. Every other character is untouched by him. In fact, if I recall, you said that yourself. It went something like this.
Shigaraki, instead, was much more directly tied to Class A's journey and the overall decay of heroism. And while All for One was obviously the guy who set it all into motion, the actual personal connections just are not there. Class A's first traumatizing experience with the villains at USJ was orchestrated by Shigaraki, and he has personal relevance to them and especially to Deku, something that All for One simply lacks.
So which is it? Is AFO too involved in people's lives and histories, or is he not involved enough? Pick a lane.
There are two common theories about his further involvement with Deku and Tenko, being that All for One is the former's father and the one that gave the latter decay originally. I hate both of these theories as they further feed into the issue of All for One depreciating the more interesting problems of the world. But what I hate even more is that now I can absolutely see both of these happening. I cannot wait.
Well, you'll be happy to know you're only correct on one of these suspicions. Also, great elaboration. How, exactly, do these depreciate the interesting problems of the world? Entertaining both of these as true, at worst, the main antagonist has created the main protagonist and his immediate foil. Everything about Deku's upbringing still happened. His quirklessness, the bullying he received. Hell, you are completely removing Bakugo from this equation, which is hilarious considering how much more of an effect Bakugo has had on Deku than his own father. Maybe you'd go for an absentee father angle, that having a strong male role model would have helped Deku in the long run or something, and he was intentionally deprived of that. Maybe you'd go for the you wouldn't kill your own father angle. But Deku has already acknowledged that he wants to save people, and he saves killing as an absolute last resort. I don't know. I could run through any number of permutations, but I'd ultimately call it a superfluous detail at worst, unless you were to add further caveats to the idea, such as involving Deku in a scheme. Meanwhile, giving Shigaraki decay? What could be worse than a child whose quirk isn't properly controllable, one that can kill in moments? What kind of damage could be wrought and emotional turmoil could be suffered? How pliable would a child like that be if they were to accidentally kill someone they loved? You know, there might be merit to this one.
And this doesn't even mention the absolute bollocks that is the actual writing allowing for his return in the first place. Quirk duplication is introduced almost sneakily, casually, and yet it's the single most game-breaking new element in the entire story. The having and not having of quirks is a core part of MHA's world, and all instances of that part being able to be altered, all for one for all, etc., are treated as they should be, with massive focus and reverence.
Nomus. Now, I admit this isn't the strongest argument in the canon, but Nomus are specifically noted to be genetically engineered creatures, not just a bunch of quirks transferred into a single person by AFO. There's actual work that's been done on them to stabilize them. And sure, that could simply imply that AFO transferred the quirks in and Garaki merely found the means to get them to cohabitate in a functional form. Alternatively, every single Nomu we've seen throughout the series seems to have the exact same strength enhancement quirk, and with how rare raw strength or elemental quirks are considered to be in-universe, it helps smooth over the explanation that AFO somehow managed to find over a dozen, or probably more, people with the exact same type of strength quirk. But, you know what? Continue your point. I'd like to see where you go with this.
Quirk duplication falls into the same category and should be a massive deal. But the story just casually establishes its existence and never revisits it aside from moments in which it needs a crappy excuse as to why All for One does something a certain way. His entire continued existence within the story hinges on this half-assed non-explanation.
Well, does it need more explanation? The only people we know that can duplicate and infuse quirks seems to be a collaboration between AFO and Dr. Garaki. The process of infusing quirks and creating Nomu are also implied to be time-consuming and physically stressful, much more so than AFO's regular quirk transferring quirk. Case in point, the Nomus and Tomura Shigaraki, both of which have a designated cooking time before they can come out of the oven. And after learning about AFO's abilities, as well as studying the Nomu, I don't think anyone would be too surprised that someone cracked quirk duplication.
But beyond what he does do, some goofy shit also arises from the stuff he doesn't do. Let's talk about the best one and play a fun little game called
Why didn't All for One steal Overhaul's quirk?
What is, specifically, All for One's goal? We haven't heard all of the details yet, but essentially, he wants to become a quirk bank, holding a monopoly over who gets to have what quirk under which conditions. In order to do this, he needs to eradicate all opposition and become untouchable and stable. One way he does this is by merging partially with Shigaraki, allowing him to exist both in his own body and as a dominant vestige within Tomura. The main things holding him back are his own broken body and the difficulty of maintaining a link with Tomura, as well as an implied limit to how many quirks he can safely hold despite having the quirk All for One.
Gonna let you continue your point, but just wanted to point out quirks are not named by divine mandate. Humans can give flawed names to things, they do it all the time.
Overhaul is a quirk that can freely control matter, reshaping it at will. This goes so far that we have seen Chisaki perform miraculous acts of healing, even bringing people back from the dead and healing pre-existing conditions, all the way down to mundane shit like cavities. Additionally, it can also be used to merge people and even retain their individual quirks within the new being, thus being able to collect quirks.
Popping in to point out some things here. You're referring to chapter 130 here, where it is implied that Chisaki's quirk cured cavities and rheumatism in the victims he deconstructed. This is only suggested, not confirmed, but let's take it for the sake of argument. Do we know if there are any limitations on that? You say it's all the way down to mundane shit like cavities, but it's the other way you have to work. It has to be all the way up to major complications. Diverting calcium into someone's tooth to fix a cavity is a far cry from restoring a missing lung or a stomach, and we have no examples of him doing anything like that with a major pre-existing condition. Sure, he technically repairs organs, but only after being the one to inflict that damage with his quirk in the first place. Additionally, the fusion you suggest was a temporary state that Overhaul had, and we don't know the lasting ramifications of it. There may be a drawback that cannot be considered yet. Anyway, I'll save the rest for when you're done.
So, with that laid out, why didn't All for One yoink Chisaki's quirk here? It seems to be tailored to serve his purposes, as it could heal his body and even facilitate his merger with Shigaraki if combined and mixed with whatever else is swimming around in him. Hell, it could even provide an alternative way of collecting quirks in order to bypass the natural limit of the body. And honestly, even if that doesn't sound convincing to you, All for One is established as someone who just can't help himself. He has to steal quirks he considers worth taking. The only people spared from his hunger are those he needs intact for his machinations.
So I'll refer back to all those fun facts I popped in with earlier. There's a lot of unknowns as to the limitations of Overhaul's quirk and some of its performances, such as the fusion or restoring matter from a pre-existing injury. This is something that applies to a lot of quirks we come into contact with throughout the story, and why, say, people were flabbergasted that Edgeshot could sustain Bakugo by threading himself into the boy's heart. We were learning a new level to which his quirk could be pushed and what limitations applied to it. Then we get to the other side of the coin, where AFO's compulsion to take quirks is factored in. If we are presuming he is in character during the scene where he meets Overhaul, is there potentially something being conveyed to us? We know, for instance, that quirks can be damaged to the point that AFO can't properly use them. The best example of this are Hawks' wings, which, when absorbed, are only absorbed in their current deteriorated and damaged state, not in their full plumage. The same would probably apply for Overhaul, who uses quirk through his hands, which are gone, so his quirk is inaccessible. But even then, All for One might be wanting to avoid contending with the vestige inside Overhaul's quirk, which has his rebellious and unruly personality. Flimsy, I know, especially since suppressing the other vestiges are like breathing to him, hence why he was surprised in the final battle, but it's still a factor worth considering. And even then, is it not possible that between Garaki and himself and the massive collection of quirks they've collected and duplicated, All for One might already have a quirk that can do something like what Overhaul can do, and it didn't work in restoring his body. In fact, we'll elaborate on that here shortly.
Overhaul is basically a more versatile version of Decay with infinite possible applications, so clearly, it should be good enough for him. So why not take it? This is a case where preparation and deliberation are present, but not acted upon. All for One has all the established characteristics that would make taking Overhaul make sense, and the two meet and nothing happens. Overhaul just remains pointless within the series, unused for even something like this.
And here's the kicker. Decay was only ever one half of a quirk. This is very late game information, but it shouldn't be surprising AFO keeps a lot of his cards close to the chest. But apparently Decay worked almost exactly like Overhaul's quirk and was simply split, leading to a more severe bodily reaction in Tenko when the quirk started to manifest. So, is it possible that a quirk just like Overhaul's doesn't work for the purposes you're proposing? And this is also ignoring all of the other body modification quirks we know he has.
The two most common counter-arguments I've seen regarding this mini-theory is that A, Overhaul doesn't have a quirk to steal anymore, and B, Overhaul is too complicated to use and All for One avoids complex quirks. Argument A is straight up wrong, at least based on what the series tells us. Quirks are defined by the quirk factor, which itself is made up of two components: the physical activator of the quirk and the gene the quirk is codified on. The physical activator would be Overhaul's lost arms, so yeah, he doesn't have that part anymore. But the genes? If DNA works the same way it works in real life, and MHA never says otherwise, then the quirk gene should be stored in every cell of the body, not just those that can actually activate the quirk. So at the very least, the genetic quirk factor is still intact within Overhaul, and since All for One is, as of right now, basically magic, there is no reason to believe he needs both factors to be intact to steal the quirk. The genetic one is probably enough. And if it isn't, well, the story has not told us that yet, so we can't really know.
Oh, well, egg meat face on that one. This is where it's important to be very specific with your language. Straight up wrong implies there is an active contradiction to the lore, that somehow something is strictly incorrect and cannot be rectified. You use this phrasing even though at the bottom of the section you say, we haven't been told if there's a limitation yet, so if there is one, we can't really know. The narrative you as a critic are presenting is now contradicting itself, and it's barely a breath apart. However, because you front-load it with such a definitive statement, it buries the lead and signals to your audience they're supposed to feel like there's a mechanical fault when you simply do not know, and in fact are strictly incorrect when the story actually addresses it.
Argument B goes above and beyond and is actually wrong twice. It is never stated that Overhaul, the quirk, is exceptionally more complicated than any other power. Sure, it's not a wild assumption to say that it probably requires quite a bit of precise control, but nothing regarding the difficulty of its use is ever explicitly stated. You might need to precisely calculate physics and chemistry, or you might just be able to say guy explodes in your head. We don't know.
You know what? Fair. This is the point that I was making earlier. We don't know the extent and limitations of Overhaul's quirk. It helps I don't particularly ascribe to argument B. I've already listed several of my own, including one that by all appearances seems to be the most correct one, but if there were people making this argument, this is so far a pretty thorough counter. Though the same problem persists from point A, where you make a definitive statement and bury the lead as you go on to wallow in the ambiguity of the scene. For all we know, Overhaul is an exceptionally difficult quirk, and if it is, that may cause problems for AFO. If that were to turn out to be the case, your statement that it's wrong on that particular point would come off as sophomoric. Luckily for you, I don't know if we'll be getting any more detail on Overhaul's quirk since it's effectively gone now.
And secondly, All for One does not mind complex quirks in the first place. He would take any he could get his hands on. The dialogue box most people misremember here is this one, where he specifically says that he's avoiding complex quirks because Tomura would not like using them. He himself has no issues with them, and in this situation here at the prison, he would only be thinking about his own use case.
Again, this is a very fair argument, and unlike the first half of point B, it's pretty rock solid with no finagling language whatsoever. Good job, probably one of the strongest arguments you've made. You get a polite golf clap. I said he gets a golf clap. That's more like it.
So, as you can see it... Wait, hold on. What was the point of this? Why did All For One even bother to select quirks Tomura would prefer if he was just gonna possess him anyway? Now that he's a meat puppet, Shigaraki surely has no influence over what quirks are used how. If All For One wants him to use a difficult quirk, he will just make him.
Because we see the merger takes time and effort. There's a significant gap of time where Tomura's personality is still very much present, overlapping with AFO's. Considering what we know about AFO's planning, it's possible the merger may not have taken immediately after the incubation period, or something else might have gone wrong that prevented their perfect merger. It's not a stretch to believe that AFO was preparing for a worst-case scenario involving Tomura.
Speaking of, why did All For One put so much emphasis on teaching Shigaraki how to be a leader? He needs his hatred to overcome One For All, but beyond that, why did he bother to ever impart on him lessons on how to lead and how to control people? He specifically refuses the doctor's offer to rewrite Shigaraki's memories because he wants him to grow naturally. All For One even has numerous scenes in which he speaks of passing the torch, of making Shigaraki the true symbol of evil. He straight up muses on the fact that Shigaraki will replace him, to himself and to the doctor. Was he just lying to himself and his closest friend? Was he just being a tad goofy? Did he just feel silly that day? Why doesn't this make any sense? Oh my god, this entire takeover was not planned, was it? It was just a random last-minute decision.
Oh god, okay. You're really taking this whole transference of consciousness hyper-literally. Like it's some form of possession where AFO is completely hijacking Tomura. But if you've been paying attention, it's a much more complicated process. There's never not a time it's referred to as a merge, a fusion of personas between the two, which means there's a give and take. You recognize AFO's receiving Tomura's spite through their connection, but you're also ignoring the street doesn't just transfer hate. Everything that makes Tomura is being shoved into AFO just as much as AFO is being shoved into Tomura. So if Tomura is lacking experience in one way or another, that could have deleterious effects on AFO's ability to operate and think. Thus, if he wants to nurture a host with hatred, he has to not only tend to that aspect, but all other aspects of Tomura's personality to ensure they're in sync enough to merge smoothly. It's why, when merged, I refer to the entity piloting Shigaraki's body as Tomura Foe. It's a fusion entity that is neither wholly Tomura nor AFO. It's some middle ground that hasn't fully percolated. As to why he always talked about making Tomura the new symbol of evil, passing the torch, AFO himself is the torch. He is passing himself into Tomura, the child upon whom he bestowed his own name. Shigaraki, once AFO's plan is done, will end up being the face of evil in the world. From the outside, it'll look like a successor, but internally it's effectively the same man, with a more powerful force of personality and a second set of memories to pull from. Now I can understand to some extent the confusion. Clearly, AFO intended to be the dominant personality in control of Tomura's body, like possession, a description I mentioned earlier. But doing so would seemingly snuff out Tomura's rage, which he needed to get OFA. So, the plan seemed to be for them in this pseudo-merged state to reclaim OFA, and once that was done, AFO would forcibly shove Tomura away once and for all. And if Tomura resisted too much, he had the final trump card at the ready to break Tomura's will, revealing that Tomura's entire life had been carefully planned by AFO, and he's had little to no agency in it this entire time. After that, Tomura would be easy to shove back down for good. Again, this is one of those plot points that I'm getting the benefit of seeing come to a close, so I can analyze each moving gear in an incredible amount of detail, whereas you only had a fraction of the picture. I'm not going to say there's no merit to this criticism, because a lot of Horikoshi's writing survives in the vagaries. And trying to work out how spirits or consciousnesses or souls or whatever transfer between quirks and AFO and OFA is probably the most mind-numbing element of all of MHA, but the problem is you dismiss there being any potential for a solution when you only have part of the puzzle. You're not phrasing this as a lack of awareness. Like every other major point in this video, you're phrasing this as a definitive ill of this story, when that's not necessarily the case. Yes, by a lot.
Now, a lot of what we have talked about was pretty dramatic. realistically speaking, these are small to medium-sized issues. All for One's resurgence honestly being the only genuinely big problem.
I do not for a second believe you think that these are small to medium problems. You called this the arc that broke MHA. It is not just AFO you are beefing with on this scale. Remember that whole preparation, deliberation, and consequence thing? You really hammered that home, my man. This comes off like you're trying to softball the last hour of you ragging on the show to avoid pissing people off.
And a lot of these problems could still be fixed. Hell, while I was writing this video, we got a chapter addressing Endeavor's feelings about A One for All a very tiny bit. Not enough to fix my problem with it, but hey, it's something.
I've already covered why I think this isn't really an important character beat that needs to be addressed, but wow, isn't that amazing? Plot points that aren't done yet might not be dropped and could just be waiting in the wings to re-emerge? Who'd have guessed?
I do, however, believe that it is undeniable that the general style and structure of MHA changed drastically during the Villain Hunt arc. It's hard to speculate on why, but either way, we now just have to look and see.
I can tell you why. You want to know why? The pace has slowed down to an insane level. Roughly speaking, the last 90 chapters spanned over the course of probably about a week, maybe 2. The last 160 chapters have taken place within a 2-month period, massive stretches of which happened during a single-day window. We're talking probably a clean 100 chapters between the hero surprise attack on the PLF and the final battle. That is 3/8 of the entire series' length, a series that ordinarily spent no more than about 30 chapters on any given plotline. Readers have been squarely entrenched in the war for literal years, and it is dragging. Major plot points are happening more frequently in quicker succession and more abruptly than ever before, to the point viewers will no doubt get whiplash. I'd say many of these problems go away on a reread, and some indeed do, but there's a point where there are several details you could do away with that are ultimately superfluous to the situation.
Many of these plot points could still be salvaged somewhat. Deku's internal conflict could be picked up in a future arc, and hey, maybe Shigaraki will free himself of All for One and return as a true main villain. Who knows what the future holds? Oh, sorry, I forgot to turn my phone off. Very unprofessional, I know. Let me check real quick. What the fuck?
Oh god, I can already see where this next part is going. Hi, from the world of 2024, where MHA has been updating somewhat regularly for the last 2 years. No, I am not. What? Oh, overreacting. Yeah, okay, I see. Yeah, you still are. Sorry to break that to you.
My Hero Academia is ending in late 2022 or early 2023. Everything I just said in the previous paragraph is rendered utterly meaningless by these news. As the Villain Hunt arc was winding down, series author Koi Horikoshi confirmed personally that the series is now about to end, with the next arc being the final one.
And considering that arc ended up lasting, 90 chapters, give or take? Kinda unfortunate for your argument. Especially since after the final battle arc, we've now gotten a 7-chapter long epilogue arc.
When exactly the series will conclude is still unclear, as mangaka are notoriously bad at estimating how long a section will take to write and publish. But even if the series lasts longer than Hori expects, it doesn't matter. The issue here is the intention. No matter the specific length left, the series is now definitively moving towards its finale, and that means that any developments on any plot points gets now is likely to be that plot point's final development.
Yes. Things need to end. And you can also have developments throughout a particular plot point's conclusion. I mean, with AFO and Tomura alone, we get something like 5 or 6 complete reversals of events.
So all the issues and narrative hiccups we discussed earlier aren't just stumbles along a grand path. They are their final destination. And oh my god, does that suck. Sure, the story could go through all of the aforementioned plot points and give them good, satisfying payoffs right at the end, but guess what? That would not solve anything.
You are aware that good and satisfying and payoff all have very clear definitions, right? How would these plot points reaching good, satisfying payoffs not be a solution to your problems? I know you're going to elaborate in a minute here, but hazard my curiosity for a moment. Wouldn't a good, satisfying payoff take into account everything that's come before, recontextualizing your biggest complaints into an overall positive? Wouldn't that be the case?
There is a time and a place for everything. You can't tell your best jokes at your grandma's funeral. Writing is the same. How good your story sounds on a spreadsheet doesn't matter if you don't pace the flow of narrative development well.
Okay, so the grandma's funeral analogy is fucking weird, right? I don't think that conveys what you think it means. I also don't think it's entirely true. I was just at a funeral for my great uncle. People were talking and laughing and having a good time because, as well as being a mourning for the dead, a funeral is often a celebration of that person's life. We all had a good laugh over my great uncle's insistence on telling the same long-winded stories over and over again. It's all about context. There is a point to be made about pacing. I touched on it to a limited extent a few paragraphs back, but you haven't discussed pacing at all in this entire video. Why haven't you?
Things like Shigaraki's reaction to Twice, Deku's training with the Vestiges, All Might's reunion with the class, etc., could technically be revisited within this final arc, but it would be too little, too late. Their moments have passed, and the best you could do now is to try and band-aid the issue such that the story looks a little more solid on a wiki summary.
Why? No, seriously, why? Why have the moments passed? You have not elaborated on that at all. You simply say they have without explaining why they have. And again, let me reiterate your own words. Sure, the story could go through all of the aforementioned plot points and give them good, satisfying payoffs right at the end. You said that as if that possibility was still somehow in the works. Why, if you're definitively saying it's far too late? I know you added onto that sentence with, "That wouldn't solve anything," but we already worked over how that's contradictory.
The Endeavor chapter that came out while I was writing this is a great example. It's solid stuff, absolutely, but it comes so late and so removed from the rest of NG's story that it ultimately doesn't contribute much aside from, giving more screen time to young Endeavor, which, again, is cool.
Because it's a stepping stone, not a conclusion. Endeavor's story, as well as the entire Todoroki family saga, still has a span of 33 chapters before it comes to an end. In fact, as I was recording this, it did come to a conclusive end with chapter 426. This scene in particular reflects a major change in opinion that Endeavor has, but it's more like a final moment of clarity over what he is, what he's done, and what he needs to do based on the musings that were set up well before this. Face to face with AFO, he can reflect on his own actions in the context of a true villain, and he can acknowledge there wasn't much of a difference between them with how he treated his own family. It's a great moment, honestly. I don't know what your problem is here.
It also suffers from the same issue Mirio's return had, namely that a lot of the narrative weight is trying to be carried by short, out-of-context flashbacks. And you simply cannot construct a good story purely out of quick memories during hype combat moments. You actually have to create proper scenes and events that build up towards these stories. Because if all it took for your story to be good was that the facts are there and solid, then what would be the point of even writing a story? Just drop all your notes and facts into a wiki and be done with it.
Finally, you bring back a good point. It's just a shame it's in a bad context. You're right that Mirio's return is a very weak moment. It's a real sticking point for me, because that was information that was kept from us, the viewer, to facilitate a twist when it didn't need to do that. We see the world largely through Deku's eyes, and occasionally split off to view it from other people's, but it's very rare that we are not privy to what Deku knows. And in those rare instances, we are often aware there is something more at play. Mirio's return, by consequence, was only barely set up back when he lost his quirk in the first place, and only briefly touched upon during the festival arc. After that, radio silent. So then he returns seemingly out of nowhere in order to stave off Doomsday a minute longer, and all we get is a flashback telling us, oh yeah, no, he totally got his powers back, guys, and everyone knew all this time. We didn't know he was anywhere near this battle, let alone on the front lines. It's a triple whammy that undercuts the impact of him losing his powers, the threat of the villains in the middle of the fight, and robs us of the triumphant moment he gets his quirk back by shoving it all into this one singular moment instead of spacing it out more gradually. Sure, his heroic return wouldn't have been as dramatic, but if it had been set up even a little bit prior to the battle, it could have saved us from suffering a really bad aftertaste as a consequence. By contrast, Endeavor isn't looking back on some information we should have been privy to. He's recounting his life, the things that first drove him to become a hero, all the effort he went through and the underlying weakness that held him back, the underlying weakness that ultimately manifested in the creation of Dobby. It's a culmination of him recognizing his flaws as a person and swearing to atone by paving a path forward for the next generation. It's his declaration that he skirted too close to becoming a monster like AFO and vowing to do the right thing even if it costs him his life. It's a sobering moment for Enji, which goes on to very clearly inform how he handles Dobby when he makes his reemergence and his family when they show up to help. Now, interestingly, do you know a similar scene to this? You should know because you actually brought it up earlier. Tenya's battle against Stain. We are provided, through Ida's self-reflection, the origin story for his path to heroism, his adoration for his brother, and the shame he feels for having fallen short of the heroic ideals he wanted to uphold. This ends up carrying quite a bit of narrative weight and helps us to properly contextualize Ida both in the broader scope of things and in the scene itself. This also applies to Todoroki, who had his own flashbacks during this portion of the fight. It's fascinating how a directional choice you're criticizing now originated in the arc that you yourself championed, and it being used in a similar way as it is used here. It comes across almost hypocritical when considered in context.
No, storytelling is not checking checkboxes. It's not going through a list of possible things people could criticize and just making quick fixes. A core component of storytelling is to order the facts, to arrange them and have them connect in ways that create emotion and excitement, not just in the pragmatic long term, but also in the more emotional short term. Rushing to get to a cool moment to then retroactively shove in all the writing necessary to support that moment mostly doesn't work, because by that point, its time has passed, the damage is done, and the story has shown its hand.
You know, you're right. You're absolutely right. Storytelling is a very complicated thing. But so is story reading, apparently, because a lot of the issues that you have do not pan out under strict scrutiny of the work. And the ones that do pan out are over-exaggerated to the point of clownishness. You also have yet to elaborate on what qualifies as too soon or too late. What qualifies as rushing? Please try to explain it to me a little bit at the very least.
It's called preparation for a reason, not post-paration?
The word you're looking for is review or retrospect, or even the phrase retroactive continuity, aka retcon. Which, for the record, isn't in and of itself a bad thing. It's just a tool that writers have access to and can utilize like any other. It can be done well, it can be done poorly, and it can be done like a Star Wars sequel.
Early MHA understood this, and that's why it stuck to the three-piece structure we discussed.
Stop calling it a structure. What you're describing is not a structure. Please learn literary terms.
However, with the knowledge of the series' finalistic intentions, the shift in style during Villain Hunt makes a lot of sense. The story threw away its more deliberate, consequence-oriented structure in favor of an insanely fast pace that catapulted the story from one cool moment to the next, ignoring annoying weight of things like build-up or consequence.
You keep using those words. Years from now, I will be locked away in an asylum, scribbling preparation, deliberation, consequence onto the walls, gibbering on about Mirio and Endeavor's daddy issues. You know what would have helped? If you had mentioned pacing at the heart of your criticism at all during this. Up until now, you have mentioned it a grand total of 4 times over the course of an hour. And it's not a disagreeable stance to have that MHA has suffered a bout of time dilation, where incredible events are happening in quick succession within the timeline of the story, but the story is being stretched out over the course of dozens of chapters to do it. There is an argument to be made there. But then you went off on this weird tirade about preparation, deliberation, and consequence, saying each word over 20 times throughout the whole of your script. These words invoke logic, an analysis of consistency, not pacing, and just about every complaint you've had thus far has been a matter of pacing, or in AFO's case, theme. Kurogiri's backstory reveal, the number of major plot elements occurring in quick succession during the PLF raid battle, cutting ahead to Deku having mastered balancing all of the quirks of OFA, the amount of focus the war-torn society gets, the abrupt appearance of Star and Stripe and her equally abrupt defeat. Occasionally you'll actually land on something that relates to logical consistency, but they are few and far between, and often they're the weakest arguments you've ended up making. Dabi's predictive prowess, the wear and tear of Deku's body, and let's not forget how you completely missed the point of the conclusion to the Dark Hero arc, meaning you missed one of the largest themes in the entire story reaching its apex. I can't help but look at this and just think that your video was poorly laid out. You got so overly attached to this idea that MHA had a secret sauce, had some killer element to its writing, that you gymnasticked yourself into a sycophantic belief in one, when all it ever had was competent writing. And as a result, your critical barometer got its wires completely crossed. I implore you, sit down, scrub the words preparation, deliberation, and consequence from your brain, and think critically about the story. You will find the problems. There are problems there in terms of internal consistency, in pacing, in theme. But the one-size-fits-all approach is only hurting you.
This is why the story becomes overly reliant on flashbacks, which hint at quieter scenes of preparation without actually having to fully commit to any of them. This is why character arcs are tied up within single pages, while previously established narrative concepts are hand-waved into non-existence, why the more complex villain is replaced by a one-note caricature. Because MHA wants to end, and it wants to do so bombastically.
And you know what? I don't disagree. I know it might surprise you since I've been playing the roving shield for Horikoshi this entire time, but I think this is right on the money. Okay, well, the first part of that section suffered from a lot of the issues the rest of this video does, forcing words like preparation in where they don't fit, but I think the gist of this passage is accurate. I haven't been quite able to process it myself, but around volume 23, going into the My Villain Academia arc, there's a sense of impatience that begins to build when it comes to developing the characters. In fact, the My Villain Academia arc is up there for me as one of the weakest arcs in the series, right next to the Overhaul arc. Both of them are surprisingly similar in setup, with our respective protagonists tasked with beelining it to a singular villain's location and rescuing a captive of some sort. Overhaul and Eri for the heroes, Redestro and Giron for the villains. Each arc features several breakaway fights along that straight path, where our protagonists are faced with weaknesses, histories, and traumas that further their development another step down the line. Deku, Mirio, Kirishima, Tamaki, to a lesser extent Ochako, Sue, and some of the other heroes, Shigaraki, Toga, Spinner, Twice, and to a lesser extent Gigantomachia and Redestro. There are clear differences, but I can't help but notice that both of these arcs dragged on and overstayed their welcome during both my watch-through of the anime and in the manga themselves, even while reading at my own pace. It was at this point that I got the feeling that Horikoshi wanted to move on. It's clear in his notes that he only expected MHA to reach 200 chapters, and for it to balloon into a 400-plus chapter affair must have been daunting for him. Which, as a writer, there's often no larger horror than a story spiraling outside of your ability to control it. This accelerated pace only builds more as MVA comes to a close, and we only manage a relative slowdown during the Endeavor internship arc. That's only a brief reprieve, though, because it's after this we go right into the start of the war with the PLF battle arc, and everything else spirals from there. But it should be noted this is only me speculating as to why this is happening. Pacing is ultimately a personal preference. There are a lot of people who are willing to be patient and a lot who aren't, and they'll take the pacing of plot arcs as they come. I for one think that MHA's pacing is kind of wonky, but I still very much enjoy it and find a lot to gain from the story.
But this strategy proves to be ultimately destructive to the series' core identity and general coherence, which is becoming increasingly evident in the current final arc. It explicitly being the final battle immediately makes a few things impossible. Quiet arcs that explore Class A and their relationships and flesh them out a little more are just not happening anymore, as we're now in the final confrontation.
Do you not think they did a good enough job establishing and exploring it? Who's all left to explore? Sato? Mineta? Every character in Class A has gotten some amount of focus, typically in relation to their fellow classmates. And this is before factoring in their participation in class parties, activities during do-or-die battles, and making references to one another offhand. I think for the time that we've had, the class's dynamic is really well thought out. You're also the last person I want to hear complaining about this, considering how you've completely disregarded the coordinated effort made by Class A to rescue Deku and every nice word people had for him that called back to multiple moments throughout the series. And, to add insult to injury, we've gotten about a volume's worth of epilogue that covers the restoration of the world, which gives a fitting send-off to every major character and gives at least passing acknowledgement and conclusion to just about every character in 1A. So yeah, I don't know what you're salty about.
Equally impossible are now arcs that focus and showcase the post-war world, meaning those 37 chapters we got is all we are ever going to get of a landscape that should have functioned as a visualization of the paradigm shift.
We've already covered this, the war-torn world is covered through the current arc. Now if you're referring to the transitional period between Jakku and what we have now, I sympathize. I would have loved to have seen the deterioration through more than a montage, and preferably with characters we know so there was more investment in the world's deteriorating state. But what we got was serviceable and makes plenty of sense from what we've been shown.
Shigaraki will also likely not reclaim his position again, and if he does, it can only be very short-lived. The underlying threat of the Liberation Army and their political machinations, the plight of mutants, an actually good focus on foreign heroics, and many, many other possibilities are just gone. All we have left is one giant war with a bunch of action figures that can now only flesh out the world and those action figures through flashbacks.
Action figures. That is a derogatory term for characters lacking substance, depth, and personality. Just a slap in the face considering these are still the characters we've come to love and cherish. As to the other elements, they were never the main focus. Are there problems there? Yes. But when you also realize that all of these elements are expressions of a much more deeply rooted problem, one that ties into how society governs itself, how people see each other, and what it means to be a hero on both the micro and macro scales, you realize there are bigger fish to fry in the narrative. Do I wish there was more from these? Yes. Do we need more from these? No.
Don't get me wrong, this final war has been really cool in places. Monoma and Shoto's moments have been absolute highlights, for example.
You mean Shoto, right? That character that helps further characterize his family through his actions, beliefs, and history with them? The one who is just as much an expression of his father despite the desire to be anything but? Okay, just making sure.
But it is also this arc that gave us what I consider to be the ultimate example of MHA's new, far less satisfying writing style. Jiro versus All for One. That matchup should already by itself raise a few eyebrows. I am by no means a power scaler, but when the guitar girl tangos with the devil, it does make me feel a little odd. Beyond just the boring math shit though, lies a much more fundamental problem. Why is it Jiro specifically that gets to fight All for One here? What is the point here? How does this line up with preparation, deliberation, and consequence?
Don't you start with that, you motherfucker! I am going to let you finish your point, but I want it on my tombstone that no one is to utter these words within a mile radius of my corpse. I don't even know what that means!
It is entirely too early to speak of consequence for this fight at the time I'm writing this, so let's ignore that for now. Maybe I'll put some text on the screen.
Then why did you fucking mention it, you motherfucker?
How did the story prepare for this moment, and how did it deliberately justify this specific matchup? Well, it didn't. Jiro has barely existed since Culture Festival, and she hasn't been set up to really do anything besides just exist in the background.
She has an incredibly powerful ranged quirk with the correct equipment. Unlike her classmates who all need to either be places they need to be for their specialty, such as Denki, Mina, Shoto, Bakugo, and Deku, or would need to get within touching distance, like Sato, Kirishima, Soji, Uraraka, and Ojiro, which is obviously out of the question for a student. It's just a matter of logistics. She's also not alone, considering she and Tokoyami are together as a team, and working as backup for Endeavor, Hawks, and a whole squad of other pro heroes.
This is how the series treats a lot of side characters. They're like sports athletes sitting on a bench, ready to be rotated into the spotlight and then benched again.
Well, in some fairness, Horikoshi has said so himself. He gives each of the characters episodes. Take with that what you will, but I typically take it to mean that they each get their own mini-arc and then they're done, because the story needs to focus on the core cast of characters. That being Deku, Bakugo, Todoroki, Ochiko, Aizawa, Endeavor, Hawks, Mirio, All Might, Shigaraki, AFO, Dabi, Toga, and Spinner. There's already a massive cast to juggle. You cannot expect every character to get the same amount of build-up and payoff.
This habit does have distinct advantages. I spent many of my first MHA videos talking about that. It allows the cast to dynamically shift around the members that need the spotlight right now, while also, by implication, teasing that all characters will have the depth of someone like Kirishima, thus generating engagement, excitement, and attention.
That's on you then. By the time the Stain arc hit, I was pretty solidly convinced we had our main crew for the remainder of the series, while all the others were reserved to filling out their own smaller arcs where they served the story best. I didn't expect anything on the level that Kirishima got, and while I'm thankful for it, I never expected anyone else to elevate themselves in quite the same way.
However, time has not been kind to this style.
A style you yourself imposed on the series.
This arrangement can only work if the individual members rotate into relevance at a fairly even rhythm, to make sure that the differences in importance are kept as low as possible.
So wait, you want all the characters in Class A to be less important? You genuinely expected the entire class to be filled with main characters? I get it. I do. One of Horikoshi's greatest strengths demonstrably is interesting character design. Into even background characters, through heteromorphism and unique quirks, he manages to build a mystique around just about everyone that appears on the page. Class A1, in comparison to the average anime classroom, is incredibly diverse and actually really well thought out. But the weight of each character's story will balance out against their peers, and gradually, over time, some stories will rise to the top as more focal to the greater narrative. Even sprawling epics know they need to tighten the leash on character focus, or else the entire pace of the story will grind to a halt.
Some characters will obviously always be more central than others, that's kind of just how stories work. But to get the most out of this relevance carousel, you're gonna want to spread relevance out as evenly as you can.
Again, this is a method that you have presupposed. In no way is MHA married to this idea. And even more again, you're contradicting yourself. Some characters will always be more central. Spread out relevance evenly. I know you're trying to soften your language here, but what you want is an ensemble cast, and that's very patently not what MHA is.
This in turn also means that the maximum number of characters it can be used for is limited, as you would otherwise create an extremely erratic story that switches focus way too quickly. MHA runs into both of these issues, as its massive cast could, even at maximum commitment to the structure, not rotate fast enough to spread relevance out evenly.
It's almost as if, from the very beginning, they weren't trying to. It's almost as if there was a very clear delineation between the main cast and the secondary cast. It's almost as if there were characters that were simply there to fill out seats in Class 1A and were simply along for the ride or for a quick joke. But let's be very clear. You don't want relevance spread out evenly with a cast this large. No one does. While it might not be obvious, the amount of screen time and focus a character gets is, in a way, a barometer by which we as an audience gauge their relevance. It is, in a way, a characteristic of that character, making them stand out among the rest of the crew, or by contrast, not stand out. In fact, it can be used as a tool by the narrative. In one of the last chapters of the manga, Sero, of all people, gets a big damned hero moment alongside Sato and Ojiro, characters who have basically been background figures since they were introduced. And it's honestly inspiring. These are guys with not exactly exciting quirks, personalities, or backgrounds. Hell, Sero points it out that he's got the most normal life of everyone in Class A, and he wields it as a sword by smacking back at AFO's logic about trauma and power. It's inspiring in the way you don't have to be someone with a tragic backstory, or a deeply seated trauma, or even someone that stands out in everyday life to be a hero. You just gotta be a good person and come through when you're needed. I honestly don't know if a moment like this would have hit me as much had we gotten an in-depth episode focusing on these characters, and any consideration for that possibility seems to be lost in your analysis.
But we will never know that because MHA randomly gives up on this structure before picking it up again, making for very disjointedly paced spotlights for most of the side characters. Jiro is a great example of this. Her last rotation into the spotlight was during Culture Festival, after which she disappeared and didn't really do much until she pops back up for this fight against Potato Head.
That is factually wrong. While certainly it wasn't a full story arc, she actually has an interesting moment in 327 where the idea of reforming the band and performing for all the people of the UA shelter is considered. It may not seem like much on the surface, but it goes towards something of Jiro's character that more than likely played a major role in the fight against AFO: her focus on morale. Unlike most of our main cast, who are focused on the practical application of heroics, fighting villains, saving lives, saving souls, etc., Jiro is uniquely positioned to be someone who is actually more geared towards PR. She's easily one of the most well-spoken members of the class, very relaxed but mindful in conversation, and she has incredible talent that demonstrably can raise morale and pull people out of the darker moments of their lives. Her arc did her heavy lifting for her, and this callback wasn't done for no reason. It was foreshadowing her unintended importance in the battle against AFO and why she contributed the way she did. Now, did she need an intricate backstory? No, she didn't. She's a good kid with loving parents, a passion for music, and an anxiety complex over performing for other people. She didn't need to get over some trauma or go through a crazy character arc. She just needed to get over her self-confidence issues like a normal teenager. Because that's what she is. Don't get me wrong, she's an exceptionally good hero student. Everyone forgets that UA students are the cream of the crop. But beneath her skill, ability, and life path, she's a normal girl.
These two rotations vary so wildly in their tone and severity that she just feels insanely out of place here. The connective tissue between stage concert and fighting Satan just isn't there, which leads to a scenario where Jiro's intervention comes across as unbelievable and frankly unengaging. What is the point, and why should I care if the series itself didn't care to actually prepare itself for this moment?
It's almost as if she's a normal person being put on a battlefield. I'm engaged in the fact that this teenage girl and one of her friends are, for the sake of protecting the people they care most about and saving society, willing to go toe-to-toe with the self-proclaimed Demon Lord. How is that not compelling? And why are you focusing so heavily on her? What is Tokoyami's arc in this fight, exactly? That he has control over Dark Shadow now? The control that we saw he had back during the Villa raid? He doesn't need an arc, he simply fits a role in the combat. He's a likable character being pushed into a dangerous situation because the situation calls for it, and both he and Jiro rise to the occasion.
But okay, fine. This is all just models and concepts, and those are inherently only made up shit that we use in order to make sense of stuff. Maybe the series ignored the structural promises and rules it established prior in order to give Jiro here a great moment, something to truly establish her as a memorable GOAT right at the end.
Models and bullshit you made up, for the record, because I sure as shit wasn't measuring this show by it, and neither were a lot of the people that I watched it with. Also, not every character needs to become a memorable GOAT. You want to talk lost opportunities? Fine, but you're talking about this as if it killed your dog. There is a dramatic amount of difference between those two extremes.
Fair enough, she does get to it all for one around a bit, and it is cool that she gets to do something. Except, this isn't a Jiro moment. Nothing that happens here needed it to be Jiro. Nothing in this scene is specific to her. Hell, even the speech and characterization that she displays are overly generic, I gotta save my friends platitudes. No, this moment has, despite her presence in it, nothing to do with Jiro specifically. Instead, it is a stand-in for the entirety of Class A, a sort of amorphous, look, they're still relevant, that ultimately only confirms how unfortunately they were integrated into the story.
What the fuck? First of all, you ignored that Deku would be dead of exhaustion or almost definitely worse when you brushed off the speeches made by all of Class A during the end of the Dark Hero arc. That was Class A's crowning achievement as far as I'm concerned, because without them the entire world would be over by now. But then you go and pretend like this wasn't a major moment for her character due to the sheer terror she experienced. I'm sorry, the people planning this battle to the death with the world's foremost supervillain didn't take into account thematic resonance when choosing who would be on the front lines. When some asshole breaks into my house at 2 a.m., I'll be sure to check if I have a dramatic backstory with them or some vital character arc I need to go through before I beat him to death with a baseball bat.
You could swap in any side character into the scene and have very little changes.
Well, I mean, if you put Koda in there, he'd probably be dead. Or Ojiro. Or Sato. Denki might have a shot. Sero wouldn't. Or Shoji. Or Su. Or Toru. Or Kendo. Or Kinoko. Or Tetsu. Or...
Nothing about this moment has any sort of deliberate setup for it to have to be Jiro. This entire sequence is just a checkbox being ticked, a make Class A do something note buried within a manuscript given hasty and clumsy form. It doesn't teach us anything new about Jiro specifically, it doesn't pay off any part of a personal journey, and doesn't interact with All for One as a character in the slightest.
I'm getting tired, man. It actually does tell us something about her. I touched upon it earlier, but it's her reaction to fighting the goddamn devil! The defiance in the face of him cutting off her fucking ear. Her perseverance through one of the most overwhelming shows of force she's probably ever faced in her life. Does that make her unique? Not necessarily. A lot of characters have gone through similar things in MHA, a lot of them in the final arc alone. But it is still an important part of her character and you can't just ignore that. And it does interact with AFO. It's the first major instance in this fight that he tastes the bitter pill, that the small fry heroes he's treated as fodder and distractions are genuine threats to him, able to change the paradigm in ways he didn't calculate, even if they didn't calculate it themselves.
It is only a Class A did something moment. This highlights how the final arc embellishes the issues of MHA's new writing style, specifically in regards to its characters. This page here is so insanely goofy because half of these characters have never expressed or performed a unique opinion or action in the entire series.
Like who? Like Koda, who had to force himself through his chronic shyness and fear of bugs to win his battle trial, incidentally alongside Jiro. Mineta, who might be one of the worst perverts in anime, but that's largely as a result of his inferiority complex from middle school now, isn't it? Sato, who accidentally bribed all of Class A into voting for his rooms during the dorm room arc with his sweets. Sero, who sacrificed his own success in the exam against Midnight just to save his friend, or willing to give Deku pointers to understand Black Whip. Denki, who saved Jiro and Momo's lives during the USJ, and was Bakugo's admittedly unwilling assistant in cheering up the crew after a major catastrophe. Need I go on? Outside of these moments, we have seen all of Class A work together as a cohesive group throughout their entire school year. Not every character needs an arc, or a backstory, or a neuroses. Sometimes they're just good people, we see them being good people, and we grow to like them. So when shit gets serious, we get worried for them, and better yet, we rally behind them. Stop trying to make MHA look like it didn't do that, because if you've been paying attention, it did.
Class A had enormous potential, but instead of having that potential be explored step by step, each of them have been teleported to the end of their journey here on the final battlefield, and we are just supposed to take that seriously apparently. This further emphasizes the move forward, be cool, don't worry about anything else attitude we discovered in the earlier sections. Who cares that this moment isn't earned? It's cool! Whoa, she hit him! Yes, sir!
Oh my god, dude, fucking please stop repeating yourself. This video could have been 20 minutes long if you just stopped repeating points so vacuously. I have to wonder how many people ended up agreeing with you because you validated their feelings once and then fucking gaslit them with repetition.
At this point, the very idea of the original structure has completely fallen apart. Nothing needs preparation or deliberation anymore, it just needs a cool moment. Any conflict with pre-established facts and promises can just be flashbacked away. What is kind of interesting here is how much this emphasizes cliffhangers. Cliffhangers are a perfectly good and normal tool for any periodical series. You want to get people to keep coming back every week, and so they are a fairly natural convention of many mediums. But as MHA has progressed, they seem to have become an oddly important focal point for the series. Nowadays, every other chapter will end with some shocking, sudden change to the action, which will then be hastily explained away in the first few pages of the next chapter.
Oh, it's almost as if multiple plot-critical story beats are coming to a head around a major event, such as the climax of the story. There have been no less than 8 distinct battlefields occurring simultaneously since chapter 344, each one featuring every involved character popping off all of their perfected super moves, reaching emotional climaxes, and arguing morals and ideals. What you are referencing is chapter 338, which teased the reveal of the UA traitor. This is the arc that's building into the actual final battle kicking off. So using the fact that the heroes and villains are corralling their forces, developing their strategies, and bringing in surprises, all to build hype for subsequent chapters, should be perfectly logical.
Mirio is here! More info next week. Yeah, he just kinda got his quirk back anyway. Whoa, Deku exploded! Tune in next chapter! He just saved everyone, don't worry about it. Oh my god, Todoroki has a new power? Find out in the next issue. Yeah, he just trained very hard off screen, okay? Please stop asking.
Look, Mirio was cheap. Don't deny that. It's an issue we both share. The Deku one is a little more iffy. I think the explosion was probably unnecessary in the long run, other than as a way to excuse the investigation stalling out there. I still think you give the rest of that scene too much grief though. And to Todoroki, yeah, he trained that. We saw that when the kids were training back in 336. You showed it. On screen, it's right there. See, I'm pointing to it. This happened before it popped off in the Dabi fight.
Some of these will have pre-established logic to them, some won't, but they all put the focus squarely on the wow factor of the moment, with only very little space and thought being given to what these moments are actually supposed to achieve beyond being cool and pragmatically serving the race towards the end.
There's also something else you haven't factored in with this whole cliffhanger discussion. We don't know the details of a lot of the heroes' and villains' plans by the time the fight kicks off. Sure, we had a couple of chapters of preparation, but most of the details, such as the flying UA cage, were left completely unmentioned. This is probably because sitting down and laying out an entire plan of attack is actually pretty boring. It's not an uncommon technique to flash back to planning scenes while the event itself is actually happening to exposit to the audience the ins and outs of why in a more energized environment. And for the record, I went through every chapter since the Traitor arc to count the number of cliffhangers that may be considered cheap. Those are chapters 337 up through 426. That's 89 chapters. My total count? 9.5. And I'm being generous for some of the ones I've given, hence the half. Stuff like the reemergence of La Brava got a full point when I don't think it was deserved, while ones I couldn't really categorize properly, like tragic villain backstory teases, got half a point, such as Dabi and Toga. That's admittedly more than 1/10 of the chapters, but it's still such a minor amount, and again, I was being generous. If I had to rank these on a more personal basis about what I considered cheap, there would be even less.
Through this, MHA also falls into a habit of just straight up lying to the reader and not in satisfying ways. Any fact can, at any point, be replaced with an alternative fact no matter how little sense it makes narratively or thematically if it serves a cool moment or a crazy cliffhanger. Traitor reveal ends on showing Invisible Girl? Lol, idiot, she was looking at the traitor, duh! Hawk's back is gone? Lol, idiot, he's fine. Hawks pulls a sword on Best Jeanist and everything points to him being dead? Lol, idiot, they have a hospital that can induce a death-like state that has never been introduced, and also Hawks just pulled out a sword for shits and giggles. Kurogiri is in the shot of all the prison villains that are being set up for the breakout? Lamau, idiot, he's just at the hospital all along. Wow, you're so stupid for believing me.
Let's rapid shot this, I'm getting tired. It's a misdirection by focusing on Toru, not a lie. There is a distinction. And considering she was rather vital in the outing of the traitor, focusing on her during this ominous speech by AFO makes some level of sense. The whole back thing about Hawks was very vague, said by the less intelligent quirk of a teenager. That vagary was both a bane and a boon, but assumptions about what it meant aren't set in stone until we learn what the actual prognosis was, which apparently was not as bad as a lot of people feared. I don't know why you find a stasis machine so bizarre when we've seen the Nomu suspension tanks. Sure, there was no indication it could be done to a normal human, but the fact there is technology similar to it should have given a bit of a tip-off. As for the sword thing, there was always the potential he was under observation, so making it look as real as possible was probably a very pragmatic part of the operation. Kurogiri? Probably your strongest one here. I'll give that one to you. Congratulations, you have 1 point on the scoreboard that no one is keeping.
This has massive ripple effects throughout the entire story. When you stop properly relying on build-up and payoff, when your story becomes intensely reactive to its own nonsense as opposed to deliberate and conscious, every aspect of it eventually suffers. The narrative tightness that created a conflict that was more about social issues than good versus evil collapses into a much less interesting, let's punch the bad guy type scuffle.
But that's what MHA has always been. From word go, the entire story has been firmly circled around the analysis of heroism, villainy, victimhood, and the tethers that bind them together. I don't know how you miss that. Everything discussing social issues has been in the framework of those that commit good and those that commit bad, and how the society around them came to influence the good and the bad they commit. Heroism gets scrutinized for being vacuous and attention-seeking, a profession that has lost its merit because everyone, public included, have lost sight of what being a hero means. Villainy is explored in the face of those downtrodden by society, people that kept looking for a release or an escape and found none. And within those two subsects, you get a great mix of characters who are driven by their ideals and those who are driven by their baser desires. The social issues inform the theme, they are not the theme itself. You have missed the purpose of the story, and I don't know how.
Character arcs that had years to marinate and could have become shonen hallmarks are now entirely subservient to just doing cool shit, logic be damned. In some cases, the series even goes out of its way to flatten its established narrative depth in order to allow for simple, more superficially cool moments. Toga's story is, for a long time at least, about having to cope with a quirk that gives her socially unacceptable tendencies, and trying to reconcile the reality of that with her desire to nonetheless participate in normal society. Whoops, no, never mind. Now she just believes that she is inherently entitled to killing people, and anyone who wants to stop her is a meanie weenie. But hey, that cliffhanger is pretty cool though, right?
Oh my god. Toga watched her friend die in front of her after saving her life, murdered in cold blood by someone who called himself a hero. She has fought against society in search of a belonging in society. That moment was her witnessing someone who only ever wanted to be a legitimately good person getting needlessly killed. She no longer has faith in the entire system, and the few people in it she clung on to this entire time turn out to hold beliefs she finds repugnant. She thinks that everyone opposing her sees her as less than human, less than a person that deserves to live, and she wants to bleed every single person like that dry. I do not know how you miss something right in front of you. Were you even paying attention? Oh, thank God it's almost over.
So, here we are. Summer 2022. MHA is embroiled in the midst of its finale, and despite the end of 2022 date looking less and less likely, the intention is still clearly there. The story wants to end.
The text is on screen, so you know it's dramatic and important. Why isn't this centered? No, really, that kind of annoys me. Center your text, man.
So where does that leave us? Do we just accept that this is what the manga is now and try to enjoy it for what it is?
I mean, you ultimately have no choice in that. The manga will be what it is unless you get a vocal campaign going over in Japan.
Do we vehemently hold out hope? Do we just ignore the issues?
Neither of these. Watch or don't, that's your first call, but if you want to talk about the issues, you can. But only do so if you know what you're talking about. Pretty sure 90% of this video is wasted space.
Personally, I am just so disappointed. No matter how much one may insist that actually MHA isn't ending and it's just a marketing tactic, or that actually all of these rushed and otherwise botched plot lines will totally be picked up again before the series ends, or that actually none of these issues are real, it's normal for a series to focus less on structure and more on bombast as it goes on.
If you think these problems you perceive will persist and the plot lines you love will be ruined, why would you want MHA to continue? What are you talking about dropped plot points all of a sudden? There was exactly one mention of them this entire video, and the series still has a pretty damn good structure. I can tell you, I enjoyed the last 100 or so chapters more than I did the MVA or Overhaul arcs, which by your metric are somehow structured properly. It's not all bombast, it's the climax.
No matter how many times all of that can come up, I cannot help but be deeply, truly disappointed. My Hero Academia was a story that stood out because it felt sincere, and a part of that sincerity, to me, came from how diligently it ordered its story and characters around deliberate and well-prepared scenarios. It was a story that was willing to have its own events matter by having them produce lasting consequences, and have those consequences themselves be preparation for the next events. It didn't reinvent the wheel, but damn was it good at cycling. And because it was so good at this structure, it oozed potential. What character would get the spotlight? What incidental detail was actually building towards an interesting development? What story was it going to tell next?
It still does all of these things, you're just not paying attention. Look, I'm going to be honest, I went into this video as someone with several gripes with the storytelling in MHA, but I almost feel like I owe the story an apology at this rate. You have gotten so much categorically wrong that I feel like I've become more of an MHA defender than I have a critic. Which I don't like, because I intended to come in here hoping to tackle these problems as neutrally as possible. Your video has actively spoiled my ability to be neutral. And fuck off with the sincerity thing. MHA has never felt anything but sincere. There is passion and love oozing out of every chapter. There is very little corporate about it, and in fact, when there is corporate influence, Horikoshi has been very honest about it. I didn't think it would ever come up, so I would never have to mention it, but during her second battle with Ochako, Toga dons a fresh set of clothes almost magically because corporate didn't want to have a teenage girl naked for an entire fight sequence. Horikoshi pointed this out to explain the discrepancy in his storytelling and was open in his feelings on the matter. That doesn't scream to me of someone that doesn't care.
It was exciting because paying attention meant that you could maybe foresee what the next thing would be. It was engaging because the series respected that attention you gave it and held itself to fairly consistent rules regarding what promises it made and how it paid them off.
And it still does that.
But now, all of that is gone. Events happen seemingly at random, with very little connective writing between them and what came before.
Your examples being one moment that was actually built to thematically, and another where an explosion goes off and people are fine.
Plot threads that were built up for so long I was in high school when they started have their conclusions rushed to completion to make space for the next big thing, the next cool moments.
Your main example being Overhaul, whose main story already wrapped up quite neatly, was used as an attaché to someone else's story, and was given an epilogue that finished his plotline in a way befitting his character.
Characters, plot twists, even the entire message of the show have become complete slaves to the series' forward momentum.
The only example you win there is Hawks' family. The rest of the plot twists you've brought up have either been fairly built to or weren't even treated as twists in the first place.
And for what? To reach the ending faster? I cannot know what led to the shifting gears, and I don't think I need to.
Actually, no, that would probably be nice to know for everyone's sake. Maybe there was a shift to try and rush things. Maybe Horikoshi was given a mandate from above to end it in a set number of chapters. Maybe this was the plan from the start, and he was lying about the series only having 200 chapters initially. There's a lot we could glean from any information he could provide on that matter because it would allow us to not make similar mistakes ourselves as creatives.
What I do know is that Villain Hunt and the subsequent shift in structure have done irreparable damage to the series, in my opinion.
You just gotta get in that last "in my opinion" there at the very end, even if you were talking in very firm terms this entire video. This is a coward's line. This is something every video essayist hides behind to protect them from criticism or debate. You only want validation with this video, you don't want discussion, especially because you're facing the most terrifying possibility ever. You might be wrong on the internet. I own up to this. I've used this phrase before, but the more I've watched other essays, the more it grates on me. I assert my claims, fully recognizing I may be wrong. And while it's painful at times, I'm happy to see people correcting me because I have the opportunity to learn from it. Have some balls, good sir. Assert your points unflinchingly.
If MHA were to go on to maybe 3 more years, it could grow and expand to the point where this period in its run would not leave too bad of a scar. But that isn't happening.
That seems like an arbitrary period of time. By what metric are you measuring that? It'd be great if you actually elaborated why you thought that way.
Fellas, it's time to face the music. This is the end. We are barreling towards the ending, and this new style is sticking around. Villain Hunt may have been the first crack in the armor, but as you can tell from how little it actually featured in this video, it has since been dwarfed by the avalanche of issues that resulted from this structural change.
Oh my fucking god, I was going to point this out, but you did it for me. Your criticism focused on almost everything except the Dark Hero arc. It's honestly kind of impressive. Hell, you even cite examples from well before it, like Genius Survival, Mirio's dramatic return, the truth about Kurogiri, Hawks' back, not to mention how you skipped right after it to complain about Star and Stripe. You know, the more I think about it, are you sure it's the Dark Hero arc you really wanted to bitch about? Because you seem to have way more issues with the PLF arc. Could it be you wanted to bitch about a popular arc, but didn't want the flack for it? So you actually dressed it up as a criticism of a controversial arc instead? But that couldn't be. That would be lying. And what did you say about that again?
Any fact can, at any point, be replaced with an alternative fact, no matter how little sense it makes narratively or thematically.
Kinda get the feeling you might have outed yourself with that one.
And so, this will be MHA's legacy. A series broken not by one arc, but by its own sudden, inexplicable desire to end itself.
Have you ever written a 400 chapter long story? You and I have both made the supposition Horikoshi is tired of writing the series, but that could be for any number of reasons, and burnout is a completely understandable one. Also, again, thank you for completely going back on the thesis of your entire video here at the very end. Glad to know this whole video was a complete bait and switch.
My Hero Academia was a story that once built towards a bright future, towards stories and characters full of potential.
Okay, minor gripe, but you don't build towards potential. You build from potential. It's a foundation, not a goal, which might be part of your problem seeing as you don't seem to understand that.
It is now a story that builds towards nothing but the next firework, the next cliffhanger, and, ultimately, its own non-existence. And that is just so fucking sad.
The text is on screen, so you know it's dramatic and important. Oh, wait, I already used that joke. Look, no more petty insults, no more jokes, no more over-the-top reactions. This is just flat talk. You spent a lot of time on this video. You say so yourself in your outro to your patrons, and with how much editing went into this, I believe it. It's clear you feel very deeply about there being something wrong with MHA. I certainly share that. I think MHA has quite a few problems that need to be addressed. However, the way you went about addressing them has been one of the most single-handedly counterproductive ways I have ever seen. You somehow invented a very poorly defined framework and forced it onto MHA instead of stepping back and trying to see what MHA was trying to do in totality. It was only upon thoroughly reading through the manga and taking over 136 pages of notes that I felt comfortable approaching being critical of the series. And even then, I wanted to get a feel for the rest of the criticisms around the fandom, so I could make my critiques much more comprehensive. I wanted to be sure I got all of my T's dotted and all of my I's crossed before I attempted to tackle the series. And then I discovered your video. With almost 1 million views and less than 1,000 dislikes, I can't see any reality where your video furthered the conversation on figuring out the flaws present in MHA. The few parts we agreed on were so far apart or so heavily buried in supposition, I felt like I was fighting through molasses to try and see your point of view. This video comes across more like a ramble of random complaints that do more to validate people's feelings about the series rather than genuinely breaking down the mechanical issues. It comes off as a waste of effort, and it's a damned shame with how much effort you clearly put into this. I really hope the next time you do a video like this, you take the time to run it by people that'll grill it thoroughly. People who will tell you you're not making any sense, or you're forcing the series into a box it was never in to begin with, or if you're being impatient because you never know what plot points may become relevant next. It will help you cut down on the time, it will help you make more cogent points, and it will make you far more convincing. That's my advice. Take it or leave it. I know I probably haven't exactly endeared myself to you. Even with all my qualifiers at the start, I don't know if you've watched this far, but I hope the advice helps you in some way, shape, or form in the future. For everyone else that stuck with me through this monster of a video, thank you so much. It really means the world to me. Like Ocean is, I put a lot of time and effort into it, and I hope that shows. Special thanks goes out to Twilight Guardian, I Know Nothing, and Young Kaiser, all of whom helped me refine my thoughts on this topic and have had to sit through all of my ranting and rambling as I worked on it. And a big old thank you to my patrons, who have no doubt been getting impatient for my lack of content while I tackled this white whale. Hopefully, my regular streams with Team Jacked on Tuesdays at 6 PM EST and Bad Fanfiction Night on Fridays at 10 PM EST were enough to sate them while I worked on this. Remember, if you like this content and want more like it, you can donate $1 or more to my Patreon. Doing so gains you access to the Tundra Discord server, where I and several of my YouTube colleagues regularly interact with our fans. It's also where I host Bad Fanfiction Night, so if you ever wanted in on the fun, you know where to go. Once more, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll catch you all on the flip side!